The sandworm was longer than the town it had just eaten. Over a kilometer of it slid under the dunes, and the ground jumped like a struck drum every time the thing turned. Most people, watching that, would have run. I stood at the lip of the crater, where an oasis had been that morning, and did the math instead. The way I used to run quarterly projections before a meeting nobody wanted to sit through. Two women stood with me, one in a mask, one with frost curling off her fingers. Both of them thrown out by the same king who'd thrown out me. The masked one asked, low, whether I really had a plan for a thing that size. I've got a plan, I told her, and the best part of a plan is that if it falls apart, we just run. Neither of them ran. That was the pattern, with the people who ended up standing next to me. The world had already decided what they were worth, told them to their faces, and somewhere along the line, each of them had quietly stopped believing it. Hold on to one thing for the next few hours. A king looked at me exactly once and needed 4 seconds to decide I was garbage. 4. Everything you're about to watch is the story of how wrong those 4 seconds were. Let me back up to the throne room. I woke up on a cold stone floor. The last thing I remembered was my own desk, my forehead on my arms after another night of overtime. Then, stone under my cheek, incense in my nose, and a room full of people in robes looking down at a middle-aged man in a purple tracksuit, 40 years old, single, a section chief at a company that would not notice I was gone. And apparently, according to the ritual that had just yanked me across worlds, I was the savior of a dying one. The young king on the throne looked me over and didn't bother to lower his voice. To hear him tell it, the god had promised a reformer once every 50 years, and after all that waiting, it had coughed up a paunchy, tired, plain old man. A dud, a wasted summon. He said it in front of the whole court, the way you'd read a bad quarterly memo out loud so everyone could share the disappointment. Later, I found out why it stung him so much. He'd only gotten the throne because his brilliant older brother died young, and he'd been standing in that shadow ever since. He needed a dazzling hero to make himself look chosen. What he got was me. I understood the man perfectly. I'd spent 20 years watching insecure people at the top need the room to reflect well on them. A calmer noble stepped in to explain the place, since the king had lost interest. This world was called the Great Desert, 80% sand, a thin central sea, and only a narrow strip of land where everyone crowded together. Monsters called sand beasts roamed the rest and kept humanity boxed in, and every 50 years, the god sent a reformer to change that. It was a lot to take in on an empty stomach. I read the room the way I read a bad client, fast and for the exits. The king had already been on the edge of discarding me on sight, so when they asked my name, I gave it plainly, surname and all, and let them draw their own conclusion. In this world, a family name meant nobility, and a noble could not simply be thrown in the trash. It bought me a month. The king's mouth twisted, but he waved me off the floor rather than out the door. Nobody was waiting for me back on Earth anyway. I filed that away and stood up. The kind noble was a baron named Stone, a financial bureaucrat with no land and no illusions. Two middle managers recognize each other on sight, and we did. He walked me over to the barracks to meet the officer assigned to train me. Marshall was a commoner major, copper-skinned, built like a door, a white scar down one cheek. The soldiers called men like him a commoner's marshal, because commoners weren't allowed to rank any higher no matter how good they were. He'd earned the ceiling, and now they were retiring him early to hand his rank to some noble's useless son. He shook my hand and said the honest thing right away. Looks and talent have got nothing to do with each other, he told me, glancing at the throne room direction. His Majesty only ever sees the surface. It's a problem. Then the door banged open and a young lieutenant marched in, purple-faced about the wrong purple. Dolan, Viscount's son, the exact species of office bully I'd been dodging my whole career. Loud, entitled, and sore about answering to a commoner who outranked him. He pointed at my tracksuit and announced that purple was a royal color, that no one wore it without the king's leave, and that confiscating it on the spot was simply justice. Now, this tracksuit had cost me under 1,000 yen at a going out of business sale back home. It had exactly 0 sentimental value. But Dolan didn't know that, and a man that hungry to grab something is a man you can work, so I didn't argue. I got sad about it. I told him it was the only thing I owned, that I'd been summoned in my sleep with nothing to my name, and that surely a noble as devoted to the kingdom as he clearly was would understand the position of a fellow noble left with nothing at all. His whole face changed. Baron Stone, straight-faced, pointed out that Dolan himself didn't actually have permission to wear purple either, which told me everything. The man wanted my cheap tracksuit to strut around in at home. Marshall offered to just hand me a change of clothes and end it. Dolan snapped that was too slow, and there it was. He was afraid some other noble would wander in and take the prize first. Speed mattered to him more than price. So I got slow. very slow. I told him I couldn't possibly accept charity from a stranger, and then I asked, with great sincerity, exactly how money worked in this world. Was a coin closer to a copper or a note? And how did the exchange run against the currency of my homeland? Baron Stone, playing along beautifully, walked me through it. A common soldier earned 2 million gold a year. A minor knight's pension ran 20 million. A baron's, 100 million. Dolan started to sweat. I kept the lecture going. I mused about apprenticeship, about training costs, about the price of dignity, and with every unhurried word, Dolan pictured a rival noble strolling through that door. He blurted out an offer, 5 million gold, to help a poor summoned noble get on his feet. Marshall and Stone both blinked at the number. I thanked him warmly, and I did not say yes. I asked one more slow question about the local cost of boots. He caved. 20 million gold, he all but shouted. Done, settled, handed over. I handed over my 900 yen tracksuit and took a payment note for 20 million. The man walked off clutching a bankruptcy sale outfit like it was a crown. I hadn't been in this world 4 hours, and the wasted summon had just out-earned a soldier's decade in a single conversation. Marshall stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed and said I was going to be a problem for somebody. Marshall told me a note that size would get me robbed before nightfall, so we took it to the church. Except the church wasn't really a church. It was the bank. A young priest had me lay my palm on a crystal ball, and the thing read me by name without my ever giving one. He explained, proud of it, that more than 14,000 churches across the whole great desert were linked through those crystals. Deposit in one, withdraw in another, all of it watched by the god. No fees, no interest. I set down the note and watched my name come up beside a number with a lot of zeros. Then he told me the catch, the way tellers always save the catch for last. Loans were another matter, borrow, and they laced the debt with a tracking spell, default, and you were marched to a church workhouse and kept there until the debt was paid, or until you couldn't work, or until you died. There was no running from a god who could always find your palm. I've got no plans to borrow, I told him. He said that was the wisest thing he'd heard all week. Walking out, I did the arithmetic in the back of my head. Every coin I owned lived in an account tied to my heartbeat, in a system the crown could lean on if it ever wanted to know whether a certain summoned noble was still breathing. I didn't have a use for that thought yet. I just noticed it and kept it. Training was martial, 5 hard soldiers, and a stretch of desert that wanted me dead by lunch. The heat nearly folded me in the first hour. The soldiers strolled through it like a spring morning, and Marshall explained why leveling up didn't just make you strong, it made you weatherproof. Even farmers got dragged up to level 3 or 4 just so the sun wouldn't kill them. Children got leveled at 10. A person who couldn't fight, couldn't work, and couldn't level was, in the plain economics of this place, left to the heat. That was the world I'd been called to save. He had me join his party with a word, and my own level flickered up on my palm where only I could see it. Level 1. He told me, flat, to never show that number to anyone. A stranger who knew your level knew exactly how to kill you. Then the squad went to work on a nest of sand lizards, and I sat in a safe pocket of shade and watched dozens of them fall. That was where the trouble started. Normally, a slain sand beast leaves a body and drops a leather purse of God's coin from the sky. Real money, the only money the god mints. But every beast that died while I was in that party simply vanished. No corpse, no coin, no hide, no meat, nothing. The veteran soldiers went pale. They'd never seen kills come up empty. My level, meanwhile, was climbing like a rocket, 1 to 7 in an afternoon. Marshall had them drop me from the party and cut down one more lizard, and that one left a fat body and a bag of coin, right on cue. The difference was me. To this world, that made me worthless. A hunter whose kills produce nothing is a man who can't feed himself. And the nobles who lived fat off other people's drops seethed that mine yielded them not a single coin. Marshall wasn't bitter about it, but he had nothing left to lose, so he told me the truth of the place while we walked. The Hunter Association was a noble sinecure that underpaid every hunter it touched. Half of everything got skimmed in tax. Good men capped out at major and got shoved aside for idiots with the right fathers. He and his 5 were retiring in a month to hunt for themselves, because even the monsters paid better than the crown. Shame you can't come with us, he said, almost kind about it. But your kills feed nobody. We'd starve inside a week. I nodded like it was a fair verdict, and I kept training, quietly, until my palm said a number I had no intention of ever reading out loud. What none of us understood yet, not Marshall, not the fuming nobles, not me, was that the value wasn't gone. It wasn't vanishing at all. It was going somewhere. I just didn't have the door to it open yet. A month is a long time to be tolerated and a short time to become dangerous. I used it. By the end, my level sat somewhere absurd, high enough to drop a sand lizard without breaking stride, and I let Marshall guess it was around 20. He believed me. I'd learned to lie about the one thing that mattered. None of it changed the arithmetic the king cared about. My kills still made him nothing, and to a man who measured worth in coin and appearance, that made me a minus. So they marched me back to the throne room for the verdict I'd been expecting since the first 4 seconds. The king didn't look at me any longer this time than he had to. He called me useless, said the month of charity was over, and told me I was being sent off to Water City, an independent island of merchants out in the Central Sea, a place he sneered at as money-worshipping and beneath a real kingdom. He'd even pay my ship fare. He said it like mercy. A noble, after all, couldn't simply be discarded. He had to be sent somewhere with a ticket and a smile, so that whatever happened next would never quite be his fault. Baron Stone laid out the route because the king had already moved on. Sand ship from the capital to the port of Reese, then a water ship across to Water City. Tickets pressed into my hand. I bowed the correct amount and thought privately that being thrown away by this man was the safest thing that had happened to me all month. They both came to see me off, which surprised me more than anything the king had done. Marshall gripped my hand at the dock, on his own way out of an army that had used him up. He told me to get strong, and that it was a genuine shame about the coin, because otherwise he'd have taken me into his party in a heartbeat. Coming from him, that was worth more than the note in my account. "You're the realest thing I met in that castle," he said. "Don't let the next lot decide what you're worth either." Baron Stone lingered after, apologizing for a crown he didn't run and couldn't fix. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He looked like a man who wanted to say more, and knew better than to say it near a dock. Then I climbed aboard a ship built to ride the dunes, bound for a port I'd never heard of, with money, hidden levels, and a mentor's warning folded away in my head. The king believed he'd quietly solved his little problem. I believed I was finally getting clear of a man who threw people away. We were both wrong about the ship. He knew where it was really pointed. I didn't. Not yet. The ship was 3 days out of the capital when the sand started moving the wrong way. I felt it before I saw it, a low drumming through the deck boards, the kind of thing you tell yourself is the wind until it isn't. Then a boy on the forward rail started screaming a single word over and over, and the veteran hunters were already up and reaching for their spears. Sandworms, a swarm of them, coming out of the dunes ahead, like the desert had decided to open its mouth. The king believed he had solved his little problem by putting me on a boat. Standing at that rail, watching the sand split, I understood I'd been wrong about which kind of problem he meant to solve. A middle-aged hunter grabbed my shoulder and pointed. Each worm was 5 meters of muscle and teeth, thick as a barrel, and he told me fast and flat where the only killing spot was: the brain, sitting right behind the ring of teeth. So the one and only way to end one was to put your point straight down its throat while it was trying to swallow you. Then he was gone, off to the stern where it was already worse. The first wave hit and the deck came apart into noise. I had never been in anything like it. On Earth, I'd sat through hostile quarterly reviews and told myself that was pressure. This was a different animal. Men who'd hunted these things for a living were being taken off the rail in seconds, and I planted my feet on my own small patch of deck and did the only thing the hunter had told me to do. A worm reared up in front of me, mouth wide, and I drove the spear in as far as my arms would send it. The thing shuddered and dropped. I pulled the point free, and there was already another. Somewhere behind me, a voice went up that cut clean through the screaming. The captain and the senior crew were gone. Not fighting, not dying. Gone. Slipped off the far side into a small boat nobody had known was there, and left the rest of us to the swarm. I filed that away. There'd be time to be angry later, assuming I earned any later. So I held my patch of deck, spear in the mouth, pull it free, brace again. My arms burned and then went past burning into a kind of numb machinery, and I stopped counting how many I put down. The old soldier who'd trained me had said the trick to staying alive was to be worth more standing than the men around you were worth eating. And for the first time, I understood he'd meant it literally. The veteran hunter came staggering back up the deck, and I could see at a glance he wasn't going to make the next hour. He pressed a healing potion into my hand and waved off my move to give it back. Save it, he told me. He was already spent, and I was the one who might still walk off this ship. Get clear, he said. Then he sat down against the rail and didn't get up again. And then, on my side of the deck, the attacks simply stopped. The worms nearest me broke off, turned, went for easier meat toward the stern where the fighting had thinned. I stood there gasping with a dead man's spear in my hands, alive on a deck where almost no one else was, and I had no idea yet why. When the pressure let up, I finally looked at my palm. Everyone in this world carries their level and their skills on their hand, like a receipt the god prints and never lets you throw away. I'd been hiding mine for weeks, telling anyone who asked that I was somewhere around 20. The number sitting there now had climbed past 120, and under it was a new line I'd never seen before: dimensional storage. I turned it over in my head while my hands were still shaking. A pocket of space I could reach into and out of, endless as far as I could tell, where nothing rotted and nothing aged. A rare thing, a ridiculous thing to be handed on a deck full of the dead. I didn't stop to feel lucky. The ship was slowing. The worms had chewed enough of the hull that we were losing the dunes, and slowing meant the swarm would come back to finish it. So I did the thing a lifetime of being practical had trained into me. I looted. I'm not proud of the calm of it. I went through the hold and the fallen, and I took water barrels, food, healing potions, an antidote, coin, spare clothes, anything a man alone in a desert might need to not die, and I fed all of it into that pocket of space where it weighed nothing and took no room. Out here, water was life, and storage made hoarding free. Karen would have had something dry to say about a man who could stay this level-headed robbing a shipwreck. She wasn't wrong, but she'd also made me promise to live, and I meant to keep it. On the ship's far side, I found what the captain hadn't taken: a second small escape boat, tucked away exactly like the first. 2 boats hidden on a civilian ship that had somehow steered itself straight into a swarm. I didn't have the whole picture yet, but I had enough of the shape of it to feel cold. I cut the boat loose and pushed off just as the desert opened up again behind me. The worms came back for the wreck, and I didn't watch. Had I stayed to feel anything about it, I'd have gone into the sand with the rest of them. Alone in an ocean of sand is a specific kind of quiet. I got the little boat running well enough, which was the easy part. The hard part was that I had no idea where anything was. This world has no compass, no needle, no north, and I'd never learned to read its stars. I had a map I'd taken off the ship and no way to place myself on it, which is a fine metaphor for most of my life, and a genuinely bad situation in a desert where a man without water is dead inside a day. So I did math instead of panicking. The old soldier had told me the great desert was freckled with oases, most of them run by minor nobles too far out for the crown to bother with. Find one, and I'd find water and a person to point me somewhere. I pointed the boat at nothing in particular and let it run and tried not to think about the odds. I thought about Karen instead, the woman I'd lost a long time ago, back on Earth, who'd told me near the end that I should have a long life, and if I could manage it, not spend all of it alone. I'd managed the alone part beautifully for 20 years. Sitting in a stolen boat in an alien desert, still stubbornly not dead, I could almost hear her laughing at me for it. I don't know how long I ran before I saw it. A smudge of green where there shouldn't have been any, a stand of trees, water catching the last of the light, and beside it, one large tent, alone, looking like the first strong wind would carry it off. One tent meant one person, or close to it. Out here, that probably meant another castaway the world had decided it didn't need. I turned the boat toward it. I was, after all, becoming something of an expert on people the world had thrown away. I was about to run the boat up onto what looked like solid ground when a voice stopped me cold. Not there. A figure had stepped out from the trees, a woman in a knight's armor, a smooth mask covering her whole face, one hand raised. That is not sand you can stand on. Bring it to the left, along the rocks, or the ground will take you and the boat both. Quicksand. I brought it left along the rocks, exactly as told, and stepped off onto ground that held. Up close, the mask was seamless, the armor real and well kept, and the stance behind both was a fighter's, weight balanced, hands never quite far from a weapon. Whoever she was not someone I wanted to test. She asked how I'd come to be drifting a one-man boat this deep in the sand, and I told her the plain truth. A sand ship bound for the port, a swarm, and me, the only one who'd walked off it. The mask tilted. The captain, she said. The crew, what did they do? I told her they'd run first, in a hidden boat, before the fighting even turned. She went very still, and something in the set of her shoulders changed. She said, quietly, that no seasoned captain steered a ship into a swarm by accident, and no honest crew abandoned paying passengers in the opening minute, unless they'd always meant to. She didn't finish the thought out loud. She didn't have to. I'd been circling the same ugly shape since I'd found that second boat, and hearing a stranger arrive at it in 10 seconds made it real in a way my own suspicion hadn't. A second woman came out of the tent then, younger, in a mage's robe, short hair, bright, quick eyes that went straight to me with open curiosity. Eleanor, she called. Who on earth? and then she was looking me over like a puzzle she meant to solve. The masked woman, Eleanor, let out a slow breath and told me I'd better come out of the cold and hear a few things I clearly didn't know yet. They fed me, which after the day I'd had nearly undid me more than the swarm. The mage's name was Hannah. She poured water like she'd been waiting years for someone to pour it for, talking the whole time. And between the two of them, the story came out. Eleanor was the king's half-sister, a princess. And this pretty little death trap of an oasis was where he'd sent her to rot, dressed up as a reward, an estate for her service, when everyone including her understood it for exile. The court called her the monster princess. Her own brother had called her hideous and dangerous for being too strong, and shipped her out past the reach of anyone who might have said otherwise. You'll want to know why I wear this, Eleanor said, one gloved finger touching the edge of the mask. She told me it was burns, fire. I let it sit because I could hear it wasn't the true reason, and because a person tells you the real thing when they're ready and not before. Hannah, it turned out, had been thrown out for the same crime, too thin, too plain, by the standards of a kingdom that had them exactly backwards. Because here, and this took me a while to believe, the women everyone called beautiful were the heavy ones, the overfed noblewomen who ate on purpose to stay lovely. And slender women, like these two, were the ones children were taught to point at. They'd built a whole cruelty out of it. Hannah told me hers, flat, like reciting a name that had stopped being able to cut her, the starving fawn. That was what they'd called her. I said the obvious thing, because it was true, and because nobody in this world had apparently bothered to. I told her that where I came from, she'd have people falling over themselves, and that whoever taught this place its idea of beauty had gotten it exactly upside down. Hannah's whole face changed, and then, quick, before I could react, more experiment than anything, she leaned across the little table and kissed me, just once, light as a dare, and sat back grinning like she'd proven something to the whole world at once. "Ah," she breathed, delighted. He didn't flinch. For one strange second, Karen was very close, and I felt the old familiar pang of a man who'd loved someone a long time ago and never quite put it down. Then Eleanor was scolding Hannah for behaving like that in front of a guest, and Hannah was laughing, and the ache folded itself back up small where it lived. And I was, to my surprise, almost happy. Eleanor had gone quiet behind her mask, and I turned to her. I told her what I'd been thinking since the trees, that a woman who'd been branded a monster by an entire court had spent years out here at the edge of nothing, guarding a border no one thanked her for, and never once turned bitter enough to leave a stranger to the quicksand. That whatever her face looked like under there, I'd already seen the part of her that mattered, and it wasn't a monster's. She didn't answer for a long moment. Then a sound came from behind the mask that I realized, too late, was crying, small, disbelieving, the crying of someone hearing a thing they'd given up on hearing. "Forgive me," she managed. No one has ever said such a thing to me. I'm only happy. That's all it is." Hannah, gentle for once, reached over and told her to show me. "Go on." And Eleanor, with hands that weren't quite steady, unfastened the mask and set it down. There were no burns. There was a face this world had decided to hate, and to my eyes, it was simply, plainly lovely. The kind of face that would have stopped a room where I came from. I told her so, and watched her flinch like praise was a thing she'd learned to brace against. Sure, I had to be mocking her. "I'm not clever enough to lie about this," I said. "You're beautiful. It's not a kindness. It's just true." Hannah, of course, ruined the moment on purpose. She suggested Eleanor ought to take a turn kissing the guest too, and the proud sword saint who'd faced down swarms went red to her ears and could barely get out a question about whether it might be acceptable someday to hold hands. I told her she was cute, which finished the job the compliment had started, and then Hannah pushed her luck one word too far about old maids and found herself in a headlock, and the tent filled up with the sound of two exiles bickering like sisters. And for a little while, nobody was thinking about the king at all. It was Hannah who put the last piece in my hand, and she did it without meaning to. Her father was a court mage, so she knew the machinery of the thing the whole kingdom was built around. A reformer, that was me, apparently. The god's answer to a world losing ground to the sand gets summoned once every 50 years, one at a time. The devices that call us can't run together, and the ones that survive can't be repaired. 50 years between saviors. Unless, she said, still not seeing where it led, the current reformer happens to die early. Then the clock can be forced. Then the next one can be pulled through in as little as 5. The tent went quiet. I watched Eleanor arrive at it the same instant I did. a ship that steered itself into a swarm, a captain paid to run first, with a boat set aside for it in advance. A useless middle-aged reformer the king had looked at for about 4 seconds and written off. Put on that ship not to be sent away, but to be fed to the desert, so a better one could be summoned in 5 years instead of 50. The king hadn't exiled me. He'd tried to murder me, cleanly, at a distance, with a plan tidy enough that no one would ever call it one. I want to tell you I felt rage. I didn't. Not yet. That would come, on its own schedule. What I felt sitting in that lamplight was something colder and clearer. The feeling of a man watching the last illusion get taken off a table so he can finally see the wood. The world had decided I was garbage. It had decided these 2 women beside me were monsters. It had been so sure of all of it that it never once checked its work. So I made a decision, quietly, the way I used to sign off on things that changed a whole quarter without anyone noticing the moment. I wasn't going to march on a capital. One tired man against a kingdom is not a plan. It's an obituary. I wasn't going to the port either, where a second knife was surely already waiting for the reformer who wouldn't have the decency to be dead. I was going to do the one thing a man like the king would never expect from someone he'd thrown away. I was going to disappear, owe the throne nothing, ask it for nothing, let it keep believing its ugly little errand had worked. And out here, past the edge of the map, with 2 people the same king had discarded, I was going to build something, a place where the things this world threw away turned out to be the things worth having. I asked if I could stay. Eleanor looked at Hannah, and Hannah looked at Eleanor, and the answer came back so fast and so glad that it embarrassed all 3 of us. Of course I could stay. It was no trouble at all. Outside, the desert went about its enormous indifferent business, and a king I'd met for 4 seconds slept somewhere believing his problem was solved. He'd been wrong about the ship. He was wrong about me. And for the first time in a very long time, sitting in a stranger's tent at the edge of nowhere, I wasn't alone. I set a loaf of bread on the low table, and 2 grown women looked at it the way other people look at gold. 3 months. That was how long it had been since either of them had eaten bread. I'd pulled it from the storage still soft, still smelling like a bakery, because nothing in that pocket dimension ever goes stale. And Hannah made a small sound I don't think she meant to make. I asked what they'd been living on out here. Eleanor answered like it was nothing. Boiled sand scorpion leg. Every day, 3 months, boiled and nothing else. So I tried it, and the strange part is, it's good. It tastes almost exactly like crab, salty on its own, no seasoning needed, an entire desert of all-you-can-eat crab and no one to cook it. There was clean spring water in the middle of the oasis, and not one thing growing, no field, no animal, just the scorpions, and the 2 of them, and a diet that would break a person's spirit long before it broke their body. I looked at that, and I decided I was going to cook. The women had a magic stove, a flat gray plate that heats when you pour a little manna into it, like an induction burner from home. Hannah had been the cook, which meant Hannah had been the one boiling the legs, because that was the whole of what she knew how to do. Eleanor admitted, quietly and with great dignity, that she was hopeless in a kitchen. She could have a charging beast, and she could not apparently be trusted with a potato. So I worked. I still had the Rex stores in the storage, and the desert had more to offer than they'd ever guessed. I grilled sand lizard the way you'd do a steak, and it came off tender, closer to chicken than anything. I made a salad from greens they'd walked past for months, not knowing you could eat them. Stir-fried vegetables, steamed tubers, a soup with scorpion meat and lizard egg beaten through it, going soft and gold in the broth. I set it all down, more dishes than either of them had seen at one table in longer than they wanted to say. And then nobody talked for a while, because they were eating, really eating, the way you do when your body has been quietly waiting for it. Eleanor held her bowl in both hands. Hannah ate with her eyes closed. The lamp was low, and the cold was outside where it belonged, and the tent smelled like a kitchen, like somebody lived here on purpose. I thought, without deciding to, that I was going to stay. Not the way you agree to something, the way you notice a thing that's already true. I'd spent 20 years cooking for one. Setting a table for 3 again undid something in my chest I hadn't known was still knotted. You should let me handle the meals, I said. From now on. They said yes so fast it embarrassed all of us. The trouble started when it came time to sleep. There was one tent, one heater, a stone the size of a melon that drinks mana and gives back heat for half a day. No switch, no dial. You just pour in less if you want less. Outside that tent, the night went cold enough to kill a person who stayed in it, and there were 3 of us. I raised the obvious objection. A man, I said, sharing a tent with 2 unmarried women. It didn't sit right with me. That was when the jokes started, and the jokes were the saddest thing I'd heard all day. Hannah told me, brightly, that her own brothers used to to say not even a starving stray dog would want her. Eleanor topped it without missing a beat. Her family had assured her that if any man ever laid a hand on her, it would go down in history as a heroic feat. They said these things laughing, the way you laugh at a scar you've had so long it stopped being yours. Here is what none of them knew. To my eyes, and I have never been able to explain why my eyes and this world's eyes disagree, the two of them were lovely, genuinely. This place calls beautiful what I'd call cruel, and calls these two women ugly, and it is exactly backward. And I was the only person for 1,000 miles who could see it, so I told them, plainly, because they'd earned plain. My judgment of women runs the other way from this kingdom's, I said, and by my measure, they had nothing at all, to apologize for. Eleanor went still. Hannah opened her mouth, and, for once, nothing came out. We laid the blankets in a row. They put me in the middle, for the heat, they said. Hannah wondered aloud whether we oughtn't just share one blanket, and Eleanor told her a woman who says things like that gets herself disliked. And Hannah grinned, unbothered, and I lay there between them, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling what I can only describe as a crisis of chastity. Because here was the other thing they didn't know. I'm a man in my 40s, not a monk. Whatever this world had done to my body since I arrived, it had done it enthusiastically, and I was not made of stone. I closed my eyes and did the thing I do. I wrote a letter in my head to Karen, up wherever she is. Dear Karen, I told her. Today I felt tempted, for the first time in this whole strange world. 20 years she's been gone. Her one wish was that I'd live long and not spend it alone. I lay in a stranger's tent at the edge of nowhere between two women who'd been thrown away, warm for the first time in a while, and I thought she might not have minded this. Then I made myself go to sleep, because tomorrow I had leveling to do. I woke up too warm with a weight on my chest, and the weight was Hannah. She'd crawled over sometime in the night, cheerfully claiming later that it had gotten cold, which would have been more convincing if we hadn't been sleeping next to a stone that runs half the night on a thimble of mana. Then Eleanor sat up, and I forgot about Hannah entirely because Eleanor was wearing a negligee you could read a newspaper through. It turned out to be a parting gift from her brother the king, handed over with the remark that she'd never in her life have occasion to wear it. She'd decided this morning to have occasion. Hannah pointed at it and accused her of scheming. Eleanor did not deny scheming. She said, with tremendous composure, that she had in fact been trying to seduce me, seriously, and that Hannah, sneaking under my arm in the dark, was the cheap version. Then they were off, the two of them trading the old wounds like cards. Hannah's stomach, some noble boy had told her, looked like a starving hound's. Eleanor's figure, they'd said, was lumpy as a toad's back. They said these things at each other at speed, both of them raw about it under all the noise. I sat up, held both hands out, and did my best to referee two grown women trading old wounds before breakfast. I told them, again, and meant it, that back where I come from, a slim woman and a woman with a real shape were exactly what a man hoped for, and that the plump ideal they'd been beaten over the head with their whole lives would have gotten no one anywhere in my world. That settled them, more or less. It usually did. I was beginning to understand that half my job here was simply telling these two the truth about themselves and watching it fail to sink in and telling them again tomorrow. Breakfast was soup and bread. I made it, since neither of them could, and over it we sorted the household out like reasonable adults. I'd cook and keep the place in order. Hannah would handle the washing for herself and Eleanor. I'd see to my own, ordinary things, the kind of small machinery a home runs on. I hadn't run one in 20 years, and it turned out I remembered how. Over the last of the soup, we started talking about making me stronger, and that was when the two of them stopped hiding. They'd been out here 3 months, mostly hunting scorpions to push their levels. It came up, easily, that I hadn't bothered to hide my storage skill from them, and Eleanor noticed that. She said a man only stops hiding his cards when he's decided to stay, and since I'd shown mine, she'd show hers. She held out her hand and told me, flatly, that she carried 2 skills. Level search. She could read a person's level off them like a page. And sword saint. I didn't know yet what that second word was worth, but the way Hannah went quiet around it told me plenty. It's the kind of thing that turns up in one swordsman out of a million. Then Eleanor looked at my palm, the way you'd check a number, and went still. 123, she said. She said it again, softer, like she wanted to be sure the first time wasn't a mistake. 1 month in this world, and I was past 100. She called it extraordinary. She meant it. And then, being who she was, she added the practical part. That extraordinary or not, it might still not be enough to walk up to a sand scorpion and live, and she'd rather I had a wider margin before I tried. Fair enough. So I gave them the last card I had, the ugly one. Anything I kill, I told them, vanishes. No body, no materials, no divine coin. The whole thing just gone, like it was never there. In a hunting party that shares the take, I was a hole in the bottom of the bucket. I braced for the flicker of calculation. I'd have understood it. It didn't come. Hannah waved it off like I'd apologized for the weather. They didn't need the money, she said. There was nothing out here to spend it on. They didn't need the materials either. And a monster that erases itself the moment it dies? That just meant a tidy hunt with nothing left to rot. Eleanor was already on her feet, reaching for her sword. She had a small sand boat, she said. She knew where the scorpions bred. So we went to make me stronger. The boat slid up over a rise, and there they were. Scorpions the size of wagons, dozens of them, working the hollow between the dunes. I felt my stomach drop. Eleanor stepped off the rail like she was getting out of a carriage. She crossed the sand faster than the sand could swallow her, and then a scorpion came apart, and I never saw the sword move. One stroke. Done. I put that first one straight into my storage before anything could touch it. Meat for a month, kept fresh forever. And the thought crossed my mind, distantly, that a single one of these creatures normally spills a fortune when it dies. 50,000 gold in coin, just spilled on the sand. Out here, that fortune buys exactly nothing, so nobody bent to pick it up. Then the three of us formed a party, said the word together, and the slaughter got quiet and clean. Eleanor danced. There's no better word for it. She skated the shifting ground, and the scorpions fell open around her in a widening ring, and every last one of them simply winked out of the world the instant it died, because they were mine now, in a shared party, and mine disappear. Hannah stood at the rail and rained ice down into the swarm, lances of it dropping clean through their vitals, and those vanished too. No bodies, no coin, no mess, just two women getting stronger by the minute and the numbers climbing behind their eyes. I stood at the back and held a spear I had no idea how to use and did absolutely nothing. I apologized. Of course I did. All that value gone through me like water through a sieve, and I said so. Eleanor told me not to be foolish. The levels still came. So where was the problem? She said, honestly, that she preferred it this way, that vanishing bodies made the whole hunt easier. No carcasses to step over. Hannah told me to stay behind them and keep them safe. And I said yes. And I thought, protect them? The two of you? From what exactly that either of you couldn't erase before I finished turning around? They were level junkies. I decided that watching them. There'd been a man at my old company who checked his savings balance every single day just to watch the figure climb, purely for the pleasure of the number going up. And these two hunted the same way, delighted, tireless, grinning at their own palms. The killing went on until the sun went orange and low. I never lifted the spear. I stood in the back of my own found family, useless as a coat rack, feeling the old small citizen guilt of a man raised never to be a bother, and underneath it, quiet and unfamiliar. Something I hadn't felt in 20 years and didn't have a name for yet. I was, for the moment, a hole in the bucket, but the number on my palm was climbing too. And somewhere out past the throne I'd owe nothing to, a man who'd thrown all three of us away was sleeping easy, certain his problem had been solved. Eleanor turned my hand over in the sun and read the number off my palm like a woman checking a receipt. One short, she told me. 199. Wait until it turns over to 200 before you try anything brave. 2 weeks in the desert, and I'd gained more than 70 levels standing at the back of their hunts, holding a spear I never once used. I said that felt like cheating. Eleanor said it wasn't cheating if the alternative was dying, which was the most Eleanor sentence I'd heard yet. Then Hannah, cheerful as a weather report, mentioned that she was level 537. I made her say it again. She said it again, grinning, like it was a fun fact about the local rocks. I did the math the way I used to do quarterly projections, and the math was simple. She could have flattened the whole oasis before breakfast. Somewhere out there, a world had looked at a woman who could do that and decided the thing worth talking about was her face. I asked her how a person even gets to 500 out here. She told me, still smiling, that she'd started young, that the other noble children wouldn't let her near them, that her own brother had told her to stop bothering people and go play with the sand beasts instead, since she was about as ugly as they were. So she did. She went out into the sand at an age when most kids are learning their letters, and she killed things, and she got strong, and she never stopped. She delivered all of that with the same bright little laugh she used for everything. That was the part that got me, not the story. The laugh she'd built to carry it. I didn't say the obvious thing. I've been on the receiving end of the obvious thing, and it never helps. I just told her, plainly, that her brother had been an idiot, and that where I came from, she'd have had a line out the door. Hannah blinked, went pink, and told Eleanor that my aesthetic sense was clearly broken. Eleanor agreed that it was thoroughly broken. Neither of them let go of it fast. While they argued about how broken I was, the number on my palm ticked over. 200. I felt nothing physical, no rush, no glow, but under the line that had said dimensional storage since my first week, a second line had quietly appeared. 2 words I did not expect to see in a world made of sand: net shopping. I read it 4 times to be sure the desert wasn't getting to me. Then I told the women we were done hunting for the day because I needed to go home and find out whether I'd just been handed the single most useless power in the history of summoning or something else. The skills instructions were short. Say the word vision, order goods, instant delivery, payment accepted in one form only, electronic money, something the interface called credits. Credits. In a world where God is the only thing allowed to mint a coin and printing your own is a hanging offense. I nearly laughed. I'd been given a shopping cart for a currency that didn't exist. I sat cross-legged on the mat, felt ridiculous, and said it anyway. Vision. A screen unfolded in the air in front of me. Not carved, not conjured. A flat pane of soft light hanging at arm's length. And on it, in plain Japanese my eyes hadn't read in a month, an online store. The kind I'd scrolled through 1,000 nights on Earth, alone, buying nothing. Categories. A search bar. A little cart icon in the corner. Home. Sitting in the middle of a desert that had tried to kill me, glowing back at me like it had been waiting. I thought the word ice cream because it was the first want that surfaced, and the screen filled with it, rows of it, tubs and cones and boxes from every maker I half remembered, each one tagged with a price and credits. And in the corner, above the cart, sat my balance. I stopped breathing. It was not 0. It was not 100. It was a number long enough that I had to count the places twice. And even rounding it down to be safe, it sat just shy of 400 million. 400 million credits. In an account I had never opened, never funded, never known existed. I sat with that for a long moment, and then the floor of the last 2 weeks dropped out from under me because I understood exactly where it had come from. Every kill, every scorpion Eleanor split, and every swarm Hannah drowned in ice. Every one of them had vanished in my party. No body, no coin, no materials. 3 whole months, they'd told me, of watching their loot evaporate the second they teamed with me and shrugging it off because out here, money bought nothing anyway. It hadn't evaporated. It had been converting. Every dropped coin, every scrap of monster the world assigned a value to, quietly routed into this account at a rate of 1 for 1 and banked where only I could see it. The thing everyone had called a defect, the trash trait, the man whose kills leave nothing behind, had been running a mint the entire time. The king had called me a waste, a dud, a minus, and he had stood there in his crown and thrown away the only person in his kingdom who could make money out of thin air. I laughed then, alone in the tent, one short, helpless bark of it. There was a deposit function too. On instinct, the reflex of a man who once checked his savings balance every single night, I pulled up my old church account, the 20 million gold I'd banked before the exile, the money that was supposed to prove I was a real noble, right up until they decided I was a corpse. I moved it in with a thought. The gold became credits. The number climbed past 400 million and didn't blink. And here was the thing I could not let myself forget, even drunk on it. This was not my money. Almost none of it was. It was theirs. Eleanor's and Hannah's kills, 3 months of them, pouring into an account with my name on it, purely because I'm the only one who can reach the counter. A fortune the size of a treasury, held by an accident of whose palm the skill landed on. I'd seen what money did to people who forgot whose it was. I wasn't going to be that. So I bought one thing as a test and picked the kindest thing I could think of. A set of 6 ice cream flavors. Foreign, expensive, the good stuff. 9,800 credits. And the same again to ship it. A rounding error against what sat above it. I pressed the button. The air in front of me folded, and a frost-cold box settled onto the mat with a soft, absurd little thump. Beaded with condensation in a tent in the middle of a furnace of a desert. I put my hand flat on the lid. It was real. It was cold. It had come from a world 20 years and 1 death behind me, and it had cost me a fraction of a fortune I hadn't earned. I stopped thinking of it as a useless skill somewhere around then. I carried the box over to where the women were sitting, set it down, and opened my mouth to explain, in careful and honest order, about the account, and whose money it really was, and the decision I thought we ought to make together. I got about 4 words in before the box was open, and I ceased to exist. Eleanor claimed the chocolate with the speed of a striking snake, and informed Hannah that taking 3 was against the rules. Hannah took 3. They fell on it like 2 women who had spent 3 months eating boiled scorpion, which is exactly what they were. Eleanor told me, around a mouthful, that her brother was a cheapskate who played at being a reforming king, and that in her whole life as a princess, she had tasted chocolate precisely twice. "Are you listening?" I asked the top of their heads. They were not listening, so I sat and I waited, and I watched a sword saint and a mage strong enough to freeze a lake go quietly to pieces over a dessert set that cost less than my old lunch budget. Yesterday, they reminded each other they'd been calling plain shaved ice a flavor. It was, I decided, worth every credit I hadn't technically owned. When the last cup was scraped clean, all of them, I want to note, all 6 flavors gone, not one spoonful left for the man who'd bought them. They both looked up, perfectly composed, and told me they had heard every word. They had too. That was the part I underestimated about them, over and over. Eleanor laid it out before I could. Out here, imports were a fortune. A sand ship crossing the deep desert had a real chance of being pulled under by beasts, so every cargo that made it charged for the 10 that didn't. And then the kingdom slapped a tariff on top that doubled the price at the gate. A single bottle of wine could cost a soldier his month's pay. In a world like that, she said, a campaign offering permanent free shipping was not a gimmick. It was the difference between a toy and an economy. Because there was a campaign. I'd read it and skimmed past it. She'd caught it through a mouthful of chocolate. Pay 1 billion credits within 1 month, and shipping would be free forever. Miss it. And every future order would cost its own price again just to arrive. Then it's simple, Eleanor said. We pay it. I'll be honest about what I'd braced for. I'd braced for the fight, for 2 people looking at a fortune and refusing to hand it back to the machine for a promise a month out. I'd sat through those fights on Earth. I'd watched money end friendships that had lasted decades. Instead, these 2 glanced at each other and agreed to spend most of what they had, up front, on the long play, before I'd finished making the case. I told them I'd keep a separate ledger then, track exactly whose kills funded what, so it stayed fair. Eleanor waved it off. The relationship already wasn't equal, she pointed out. I was the only one who could reach the store at all. A ledger was for people who didn't trust each other. Then, lighter, she added that pretty women got helped through life, and plain ones learned to help themselves, so they'd long since stopped counting who owed whom. I looked at the 2 loveliest people in 100 miles, casually calling themselves plain, and kept my broken opinion to myself. We pooled what they had, their own banked coin, 3 months of it, dropped into the account with a thought, and the number climbed to just under 700 million, which left us roughly 300 million short of the billion, with a month on the clock. Then I searched a few more things, quietly, to see what this world overpaid for. Honey, sugar, ordinary pantry sugar, the kind that sits ignored in every kitchen on Earth, priced here at nothing, against a world where sweetness was a luxury. Even a princess tasted twice a lifetime. I didn't say much about it. I just filed it away. The way you file away a crack in a wall you're going to come back and open later. 300 million in a month. Hannah did the sum out loud and said it was doable if we hunted the right things. There's the named, Eleanor said. I asked what a named was. A giant, she explained. A single scorpion grown far past its kind, big enough that people gave it a name, worth an enormous bounty on death. We know where one is, Hannah added, entirely too pleased. We've been feeding it. I asked her to repeat that as well. They had, it turned out, spent months quietly fattening a monster, dragging it dead scorpions, helping it grow, not for any reason. They were bored, marooned at the edge of the world with no one to talk to and nothing to do. And they'd decided a truly enormous boss would make a fun event someday. They'd been raising a pet the size of a house purely for the pleasure of one day killing it. I felt a small, genuine flicker of sympathy for the scorpion, who had been given a good life and a growing waistline on the strict condition that it die the moment 2 very strong, very bored women needed shopping money. I did not raise the objection. Some things you learn to just let happen. The pet was 30 meters of it. It came up out of a fold in the dunes the color of a fresh burn, 3 times the size of anything I'd seen the women fight, claws like ship prows, and I did what any reasonable man would do, and took 2 steps back to stand safely behind the people with the powers. I asked, hopefully, whether being that big meant it moved 3 times as fast. Hannah laughed and told me the opposite. Bigger meant slower. Slower, she added, and strong enough to cut a person in half with 1 claw and finish anyone it merely scratched inside an hour, so it wasn't as if slow made it safe. Then she stopped chatting and got to work. She didn't rush it. She raised one hand almost lazily, the way you'd point out a hill to someone, and the desert around the named simply stopped. Frost bloomed out of nothing and climbed the thing in a heartbeat, up the legs, over the shell, sealing the raised claws mid-swing. 30 meters of monster went from charging to a statue of itself, a few legs still twitching at the very tips. and then not even that. I was still absorbing that when she turned her other hand up and lifted Eleanor off the sand, straight up. Eleanor rose into the amber light like she weighed nothing, higher than the frozen scorpion, higher than seemed useful, sword drawn, perfectly calm about being flung into the sky by her friend. At the top, she simply tipped over and came down. I never saw the stroke. I want to be clear about that. I was looking right at her, and my eyes could not hold the moment the blade did its work. One instant, she was falling with the sword above her head. The next, she was standing lightly on the sand, and the frozen mountain behind her was two clean halves sliding slowly, quietly apart, without a drop of anything spilled. The whole monster shimmered once and was gone, the way everything I'm near goes, banked to a number I couldn't yet see. "It's beautiful," I said, because it was. Eleanor caught herself mid-composure, went faintly flustered at being called beautiful over a bisected scorpion, and recovered by informing me that my standards were, as established, reversed. Hannah pointed out loudly that she had done the harder half and asked whether her magic had not also been splendid. I told her it had been extremely splendid. She said I'd only said that because Eleanor complained first. There was, I was learning, no winning this particular argument, and I'd stopped trying to. I said vision and checked. A new notice sat waiting at the top of the store. A feature had unlocked. A friend service, it called it, letting the screen be shared with up to 5 other people. I turned it on for the 2 of them without thinking twice, and watched their faces when a pane of glowing light bloomed in the air where they could both see it. Hannah leaned right into it, delighted, and noticed at once that the words on her side read in her language, while mine read in mine, the same store speaking to each of us in our own tongue. And under the cart, the balance had jumped. The named had been worth a fortune of its own, around 120 million on its own death, and the number now sat just short of 800 million, just short of 800, a month of runway and only a couple hundred million left to the billion. We could do it, Eleanor decided, if we were efficient about it. Clean scorpion hunts, one after another, the wandering named steering clear of these dunes anyway because something nearby tasted bad to them. Efficient meant I stayed out of it. She said it kindly, but she said it. Don't fight. It only slows us down. I looked at the woman who folded monsters in half by falling on them, and the one who'd frozen a house solid while making small talk, and I decided my ego could survive being told to stand at the back and hold the account. So that's what I did. I stood at the edge of their hunts with a fortune in my hand, and a store from home hanging in the air, the richest man in a world that had thrown me out with the trash, and I watched the 2 people that same world had discarded turn boredom into a billion. I figured, some quiet night, I'd like to learn a little magic myself, but there was no hurry. For the first time in 20 years, I had somewhere to be, someone to be it with, and a number on my palm that only ever went up. 23 days. That was how long it took 2 women to kill their way to a billion. Eleanor held out her palm and read the running number off the floating screen, the way I used to read a quarterly total, flat and unimpressed. And then the number stopped climbing, and the screen changed. One plain line unfolded across the air where the store lived. Free shipping, permanent, paid in full. I had spent my whole life doing projections for a company that never once surprised me. Now I was sitting in the sand holding an infinite one, and the only thing left to decide was what to buy first. I bought ice, 3 flavored ice pops, the cheap fizzy kind, 70 credits each, and I folded them out of the air onto a cloth while the women were still catching their breath. Eleanor announced that she was extremely particular about the taste of ice, which was a bold thing to say about a thing she had never eaten, and then she went quiet with the stick in her mouth and did not say anything else for a while. Hannah could conjure ice all day long. Flavorless ice, she said, licking hers down to nothing. Magic never bothered to make it sweet. That was the word that turned the afternoon, because sweet in this world was a fortune. Hannah told me a single small spoon of honey went for 10,000 gold here. Bees don't live in sand, and the good white sugar was a state secret some far kingdom guarded like a border. I said nothing. I just brought the store back up and searched. 2 kilos of honey, 5,000 credits, 30 kilos of sugar, 8,000. Priced like an afterthought, the way it was priced on a shelf back home where nobody thought twice about it. I turned the screen so they could see. Eleanor stopped breathing. Hannah made a sound I can only describe as a kettle. They had grown up being told that even if they ate their fill and got soft and round, they would still be monsters. So they had never bothered. Black sugar, the coarse, cheap kind, was as sweet as either of them had ever gotten to be. And here was a man from nowhere holding out white sugar by the sackful for less than an hour of their work. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. A sack that cost me nothing, in a world that would trade a soldier's salary for a spoonful. That wasn't a snack. That was the first real fortune, sitting on a screen, waiting for me to reach out and take it. They went back to hunting that same evening. I have watched grown men flee sand scorpions. I have never in my life seen anything move through them the way those 2 moved once white sugar was on the table. While we sat in the sand licking melted sugar off our fingers, a long way north, a king was deciding I was dead. I only learned the shape of it later, but the shape is worth telling because it is the funniest thing in this whole story. A priest had done the king a quiet, filthy favor, traded scraps of information with clergy across a border to slip past the church's own secrecy, and he came back with one fact: my account was gone. The church holds everyone's money and closes a man's account the day he dies, seizes whatever is in it if no one is left to inherit, and I had no one. So when the priest checked and found the account simply gone, no withdrawals, nothing drawn out, he read it the only way the rules allowed. The depositor was dead. The church had swallowed his coin. The king was satisfied. He called it a shame the way you'd call bad weather a shame, and moved on. He would wait the 5 years it took to build the power for another summoning, get himself a better savior next time, and in the meantime, he had a list of nobles he intended to be rid of, and grand plans about greening the whole desert, and a title he'd given himself: Reform King. He said the word about a corpse he was certain was rotting in a sandworm's belly. Here is the part he did not check. I had emptied that account myself weeks before, moved every last coin into a store he could not see or imagine. The proof of my death was just me, quietly getting rich. 2 men suspected: a tired baron who'd been kind to me, and the commoner major who trained me. They'd looked at a ship that steered itself into a nest and come away certain it was murder, and half certain the dead man wasn't. But you cannot prove a corpse is alive, not to a king who needs it dead, so they held their tongues and went on with their lives. The king counted me among the things he'd thrown away and forgot me. I cannot describe how much I wanted him to keep forgetting. The trouble with a home you never chose is that it can quit on you without notice. I noticed the water first. The spring that fed our whole little green patch had dropped, not evaporated off the top, dropped. The mark on the stone where it used to sit now a hand's width above the surface. I called Eleanor over. She called Hannah, who knelt at the edge, looked a long moment, and told us plainly that oases die. No warning, no cause anyone could point at. This one had simply started to. Eleanor laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. She said it was exactly like her brother hand his cast-off sister a green rock and not bother to check whether the rock was already dying under her. Maybe he knew. Maybe he just didn't care to look. He'd told her once that if she failed out here, no one would grieve. I said the obvious thing. We owed this kingdom nothing. Nothing at all. If the ground under us was quitting, then we quit it first, and we did it before the water was gone instead of after. Hannah spread a map across the sand and put her finger on the truth of the place. The king's power was dots, she said. This oasis, that city, a line of controlled wells. And between the dots was open desert that belonged to no throne. We could sail off the edge of everything he owned in a week and never once cross a border he could feel. Other lands, other water, if we were lucky and careful. Nobody argued. There is a particular freedom in being already dead to the people who might otherwise chase you. You cannot outrun a desert on foot, so we built. We had 2 little sand ships, identical, and I'd read enough to know 2 hulls make a steadier boat than one. I ordered wood and saws and hammers and a keg of nails, and for 3 days we lashed the pair into a single wide catamaran with room to live on. Hannah spent an afternoon inside the magic engines, coaxing them to push the heavier boat as fast as one, and when she finished, it ran true. Before that, I filled barrels, clean spring water, while it was still clean, poured off into containers, and tucked away in my storage where nothing spoils and nothing leaks. Enough water to make us our own moving well, so the death of the oasis couldn't reach us on the road. It was Eleanor who stood over the trees at the end and got quiet. When the spring finished dying, she said, all of this would go under the sand. The palms, the little green things that had no say in any of it. It was a pity. She said it low, like she was apologizing to them. And there it was, 20 years folded up small in my chest, and her one soft sentence pressed on exactly the right place. I told her we'd take them with us, uproot the lot, roots and soil and all, and store them the way I'd stored the water, and plant them again wherever we landed. Eleanor tore full-grown palms out of the ground with her bare hands like a woman pulling weeds, and I packed the desert's whole small garden into a warehouse that no one else could open. I didn't tell them why it mattered so much to me, not yet. A long time ago, someone I loved had said almost the same thing about a tree, that it was pitiful to let a living thing dry up and die, and we had planted one together in the yard of the house I grew up in. She never saw it get tall. That's the part I wasn't ready to say out loud. We sailed at first light, the dead oasis shrinking behind us, its whole green life riding along in the dark of my storage. The desert out past the kingdom is called the Desert Sea, and it earns the name. Days of empty. Sand to every edge of the world. The boat, humming southwest. and no company but 2 women who could level a monster in the time it took me to blink. To fill the quiet, I told them about Karen. I met her at university, at a club party I almost didn't go to. I was already the man I am now, just younger, plain, easy to overlook, the sort nobody chose first. She was the kind of pretty that made you check whether she was really talking to you. I never worked out why she picked me. She just did, the way you'd pick a song without needing a reason, and we were a pair after that the way water is wet. We were job hunting when she collapsed. The word the doctors used was leukemia, the fast kind, and I told myself the whole way through that we were going to beat it. I landed a job I had no business landing, a company that would never have looked twice at me, and I did it for the 2 of us, for the after we were going to have. I was so sure of the after. They told us there wasn't going to be one. I refused to hear it. She heard it fine. Near the end, she was the strong one. She scolded me for even thinking about quitting the job I'd fought for, told me not to throw my life away chasing after hers, and she made me promise something I had no intention of keeping. When she was gone, she said, I wasn't to spend my life standing at her graveside. I was to find someone, really find someone. I said no. She said it anyway. The last thing she wanted was cherry blossoms, to go and sit under them and look. Flower viewing, in the spring, the ordinary happy thing families do. I think that's what she was seeing when she asked for it. We never got to go. After that, I put my head down and worked for the better part of 20 years and never once let anyone close. I told myself I was being faithful. Somewhere in the last few years, I'd started to suspect I was just being a coward, that I'd been using a dead girl I loved as a wall, so I'd never have to risk loving anyone again. I got that far and looked up, and both of them were a wreck. Eleanor had tears running clean down her face, telling a woman 20 years gone that she understood. She understood the unfairness of it. Hold on. Actually addressing Karen, out loud, across 2 worlds. Hannah was worse. Hannah was sobbing openly about a sad, sad love story, and then she took the handkerchief I'd thought to buy and blew her nose into it with a honk that would have emptied a train car. Most men, I thought, would be put off by that. I wasn't, is the thing. I looked at these 2 crying their eyes out over the worst day of my life, and for the first time in 20 years, the ache in my chest didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door somebody had just left open a crack. That night, I dreamed about her for the first time in years, and she came in swinging. She looked exactly as she had, and not a day older, and the first thing she did was tell me off. She'd been watching, apparently. She'd seen me hold 2 women at arm's length for months, with the same old excuse. When I opened my mouth to say I was an old man now, past all that, she hit me square in the chest and told me to stop it. Then she said the thing that took the floor out from under me. She hadn't just died and gone quiet. On the other side, she'd been busy. Training, she called it. Learning how to reach across into a world she'd been given a hand in watching over. And she'd made a bargain. She had asked to have me sent here, to this desert, this second life, on purpose, because she had looked down at a man drifting through 20 gray years, half alive at his desk, and decided she was not going to let me spend the whole run mourning her. She'd rather spend me somewhere I might actually live. Buy those 2 some rings, she told me, plain as grocery money. Not a headstone for me, rings. I didn't know whether to thank her or be frightened of her. She'd given me a whole world and stolen the old one to do it, and she said both of those things in the same breath as if they cost the same. Maybe they did, to her, now. She promised we'd find each other again a lifetime down the road, when my new one was properly spent. She told me to quit apologizing to a memory and go be happy with the living people who were right there, sleeping on the other side of the canvas, waiting for me to notice them. Then she was gone, the way the good dreams always end, a half second before you're ready. I woke up in the dark with the tent breathing around me and the strangest lightness in my chest. Like a coat I'd been wearing so long, I'd stopped feeling the weight of it had finally come off my shoulders. 20 years. She'd carried the permission across 2 worlds to hand it to me, and I finally took it. If they'd have me, I decided, lying there, I'd let myself be had. I opened my eyes to 2 faces about a hand's width from mine, watching me sleep. They claimed they were only hungry. I let them have that. I got up, and instead of cooking for them the way I always had, I put them to work, handed Eleanor the eggs, and told her to fry them, gave Hannah the pot and the makings of a soup, and stood back to referee while the pair of them turned breakfast into a contest they both fully intended to win. Eleanor cracked an egg into the pan and watched the yolk stay whole and runny like it was a magic trick. It half was, to her. Nobody out here ate eggs that fresh. We ate on the open deck with the dunes going gold, and the boat woke under us and pushed on toward wherever the map ran out. I don't want to make it sound like grief just packed up and left. It doesn't. But it had stopped being the only thing I was carrying. Behind us, a dying oasis was going quietly under the sand, and a king a long way off was congratulating himself on a dead man. And neither of those was true anymore. Not really. The oasis was riding with us in barrels and roots, and the dead man was sitting on a boat between two women, eating a hot breakfast he hadn't cooked, thinking about rings. We were sailing toward nothing marked on any chart. No throne owned the sand ahead. Somewhere out there was new water and new ground, and enough stored life to make it green, and a fortune waiting in a screen only I could see. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't running from anything. I was going somewhere, and I was letting myself want to arrive. 2 days southwest of anything I could name, Hannah's little detector started ticking, and she said the word I'd learned to dislike: worms, ahead of us, and they're already eating. We came over a dune and found the meal, a small trade ship, cracked open like a dropped crate, half of it gone into the sand. The crew was already past helping. A knot of sandworms was working through the hull, because out here, wood is worth more than the people who ride it. Eleanor was over the rail before I finished thinking about it. She never needed a reason to move, only a target. Hannah rode a sheet of ice down off the deck and pinned the things in place, and between the two of them, the swarm was gone in under a minute. I threw my spear at two of them and hit one, which was a decent afternoon by my standards. I'm 40 and I manage the money. That's the arrangement. Out here, the law is simple. Whatever you pull off a wreck is yours, because no widow is going to cross a worm nest to argue about it. So we climbed into the ruin and took what it owed us. The cargo was salt and coarse black sugar, worth having. But the real find was a box, a magic storage box, the size of a small house folded into a chest, one of maybe a handful in the whole world. Hannah told me flat what it was worth. That box alone is about 100 million gold, Marcus. I looked at it for a long moment, and I didn't see a box. I saw a cover story, because here was my problem. My store back home sold white sugar by the sack for almost nothing, and out here, 1 spoon of the stuff cost a soldier's monthly wage. That gap was a fortune waiting to happen. But a nobody who suddenly turns up with tons of flawless white sugar, and no supplier gets questions, and questions get me killed. A dead merchant's storage box, though, is exactly the kind of thing an honest trader is supposed to be hauling. So we stored the wreck and its real cargo away in my own warehouse to sell somewhere far off, and we filled that box with 500 sacks of my cheap, perfect sugar, 15 tons of it. Then we hid the broken ship, turned the bow, and sailed for the trade city. Eleanor watched me work with a small frown. You still feel sorry for him, the dead owner. He was about my age, I said. Then I closed the lid. There's a version of me that gets to stay soft out here, and I keep meeting him at the wrong moments. Shipland was the first real city I'd seen in this world that wasn't trying to kill me. A trade town on neutral ground, run by a lord who called himself a modest viscount, so the kingdom wouldn't get jealous, and everyone got rich pretending the arrangement made sense. We paid 20,000 gold a day to moor the boat and walked in. The girls put on the masks before we hit the streets, plain smooth ones I'd ordered off the store, because out here they're famous, and out here they're called ugly. The world has its beauty backwards, and my eyes never got the memo. So to me, I was walking two of the loveliest women in the city into a room full of people who'd been taught to look away. I keep that opinion to myself, mostly. The biggest merchant house in town was the Garrett Trading Company, so that's where we took the sugar. A young clerk met us, apologized for the rudeness, and explained they had to check for fakes because half the white sugar in the desert was really just clean sand. Then he tasted it, went quiet, and left to fetch someone with more authority than he had. The man who came back was the president himself, Garrett. Genial, sharp-eyed, the kind of easy smile that's doing arithmetic behind it. He tasted the sugar, and he stopped smiling the way a man stops smiling when he realizes he's looking at money. He didn't haggle. He offered to buy all 15 tons in cash, and the number he said out loud was 50 billion gold. I gave him the story I'd rehearsed. The sugar was repayment on an old debt. My name was Marcus. He nodded along like he believed every word, and he did not believe a single one. I watched him take in the box, the volume, the two masked hunters at my shoulder, and file it all somewhere careful. He paid in cash because I'd learned the hard way never to trust anything that lives inside a church ledger. And when the count was done, he wrote me a letter of introduction to a good shipyard and said something warm about how a fine deal deserved a favor. Out on the street, Hannah tilted her masked face at me. He knew, she murmured. Every word you said, he knew. Of course he knew, I said. That's why I liked him. The shipwright was a gruff old craftsman who looked at our lashed-together catamaran, sucked his teeth, and called it a botched job. Then he looked closer at the wood and the nails, said this was foreign make and good, and shot me a glance I pretended not to catch. He quoted 500 million gold for a proper vessel, sturdy, built to cross long, empty desert, and carry storage boxes in the hold. I told him I'd take a hull he already had, half finished, so we could sail sooner, and I paid the whole price without arguing a single coin of it. That was the part Eleanor couldn't let go. Back on the street, she asked it plainly. I don't know how these things work, she said, but shouldn't a merchant always haggle? You didn't even try. Fair question. It looked like a rich fool throwing money around. It wasn't. There are discounts you're allowed to ask for, I told her, and discounts that insult the man who vouched for you. Garrett wrote me that letter. If I'd squeezed his shipwright for a better price, I'd be telling Garrett his recommendation was worth beating down. A relationship with the biggest trader in the city is worth more than any discount he could ever give me. So I overpaid on purpose, and now two powerful men think of me as easy to deal with and worth keeping. Hannah grinned under her mask. So, the careless spending is the careful part. It usually is. We were about to go find the most expensive inn in town when a Garrett man caught up to us with an invitation. His master would be honored if we'd stay at his mansion while our ship was fitted. Eleanor muttered that it sounded like climbing willingly into a sand beast's nest. She wasn't wrong, but a merchant that size doesn't burn a client he just made a fortune off of, and I hadn't slept under a real roof in longer than I wanted to count. So we said yes and walked straight into the nest. The mansion was nearly as grand as the Viscount's, and Garrett didn't waste our time pretending otherwise. Behind closed doors, with the masks off, he laid his cards on the table one at a time, and every card was one we'd hoped nobody in this world was still holding. He knew Eleanor was a princess turned exile. He knew Hannah was a baron's daughter thrown away with her. And then, watching my face the whole time, he told me he knew I was the reformer the kingdom had summoned and buried. I didn't confirm it. I didn't have to. He'd already read the answer in how still I got. He wasn't threatening us. He was recruiting us. Because Shipland, he explained, was living on borrowed time. The king meant to swallow the city whole inside 5 years and was bleeding his own people with taxes to build the army that would do it. He also let slip, almost gently, that the king believed the old reformer was dead. His account had vanished from the church ledgers, and to that world, a closed account meant a closed coffin. I kept my face flat, but inside I was almost laughing. The king thought he'd killed me. He hadn't. I'd emptied that account myself weeks ago, and he'd mistaken my caution for my corpse. A man who tries to murder you and then relaxes because he thinks it worked is a man who has handed you every advantage there is. Then Garrett got to the part that had him actually afraid, and he told us about the void. A sandworm over a kilometer long, with a mouth wide enough to swallow a town. It ate whole oases and moved on. It had no head to cut off. Slice it anywhere, and the piece grew back. Ice didn't hold it, and fire didn't burn it. And every famous hunter in Shipland had already looked at the problem and walked away. It had wiped an oasis called Torrent off the map, and Shipland was next in line, maybe a week out. The bounty for its death had climbed to 1 billion gold, and Garrett offered on the spot to double it to 2. Everyone in the room understood the shape of the thing, a monster with no weak point and no off switch. You cannot stab what has no heart and no head, and you cannot outlast what heals faster than you can hurt it. Eleanor said it was a difficult request. Hannah quietly agreed. Both of them were right, and both of them were watching me, because I hadn't said no yet. I was doing something worse than that. I was smiling, because a thing that eats everything has a throat, and a throat is a road that leads straight to the inside, where all that pretty regeneration lives. You don't have to find a monster's weak point if you're willing to build one. We'll take it, I said, on one condition. If it goes wrong, we run, and nobody calls us cowards for it. Garrett agreed to every word before I'd finished the sentence. Garrett's people finished our ship 2 days early, which told me he'd guessed I'd say yes before I did. We took it southwest, past a sad little parade of refugee boats fleeing Torrent with whatever they could carry, and we went to meet the thing that had emptied their home. I heard the void before I saw it, a grinding that came up through my boots. Then the dune ahead of us simply stood up. I had braced for big. Big was not the word. It was a wall of pale segmented flesh, taller than any building I'd stood in, running off to the horizon in both directions, hauling its whole endless length up onto the surface instead of burrowing, showing off. Even the monsters in this world had egos. Its mouth was a wet round pit, ringed with grinding plates, dripping thick ropes of saliva, and it turned that pit toward our little ship like it was already deciding which end of us to start with. "Shall I try cutting it into rings?" Eleanor asked, and there was actual hope in it. "You'd just be feeding it exercise," I said. "It grows back. We're not cutting it. We're We're going to poison it from the inside. I opened the warehouse and started handing out the plan. Not swords, protective suits, sealed and hooded, and heavy gas masks over all our faces. Then containers, hundreds of them, plain plastic jugs of household bleach, and plain plastic jugs of strong acid cleaner, the two most boring things on my store. The two things every bottle on earth warns you in bold letters never, ever to mix. Hannah caught it first because she's quick. You're going to make it mix them. Inside itself, the operation, I said, is called don't mix. Danger. Bleach and acid together make chlorine gas. It doesn't stab one spot and wait to be healed. It floods every wet surface at once, all along that kilometer of throat and gut, everywhere and instantly. You can regrow a wound. You cannot regrow around a poison that's already in every breath you take. Hannah threw the ship in tight and steadied it right at the lip of that grinding mouth, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off it. And we started throwing, jug after jug, two-handed, into the pit. Eleanor was a catapult, launching whole crates of the stuff down its throat and reaching for more before they landed. When my aim wandered, Hannah caught the containers midair with a flick of wind and steered them straight in. The void did exactly what a thing that eats everything does. It ate. It swallowed hundreds of jugs of the two chemicals you are never supposed to keep in the same room, and its own gut acid cracked them open and stirred them together. For a moment, nothing. It kept coming, kept gaping, kept sure of itself, and I had one bad breath where I thought a lifetime of warning labels had lied to me. Then the whole kilometer of it shuddered. The grinding choked off. That vast body, the thing no blade in this world could kill, began to thrash blind and wild, slamming its length against the dunes, throwing up curtains of sand, not attacking, trying to get away from something that was already inside it and had no outside to flee to. Hannah threw a lock of ice around a stretch of it to hold it down, while the reaction did its quiet chemistry in the dark, and Eleanor came down off the rail in a long, clean fall and put the finishing strikes exactly where they'd matter now that it couldn't heal. It didn't take long after that. The unkillable void, the monster that ate towns, the thing 100 hunters had run from, went still. Then it thinned and it faded, and it was gone the way everything I kill goes gone, leaving nothing behind but the reward. I stood on the deck of a ship I'd bought with sugar, in a mask I'd ordered for a few coins, and looked at the empty stretch of sand where a legend used to be. Turns out even a god of the desert has to breathe, I said. Nobody could see me grinning under the mask. That was probably for the best. The trouble with killing a monster that vanishes is that there's no body to show anyone. Back in Shipland, the skeptics folded their arms and asked where their proof was, and Garrett, to his credit, believed us on our word, but sent scouts anyway to keep the doubters quiet. A week later, the scouts came back having found exactly nothing, all across the sand where the void should have been, and nothing was the only proof that mattered. They paid the bounty, and then some. The void had spent years swallowing whole oases, and every coin and treasure in all those bellies had converted along with it, so the final number came out past 2 trillion. I'm still not sure I can hold a number that size in my head. I've decided not to try. Garrett made one more offer, and it was a generous one. He'd have the king install Eleanor as the new countess of the freed torrent land, a real title, a real seat, a stronghold in the southwest. A lesser man than me might have taken it. Eleanor turned it down before I could. I was half thrown away by my brother once already, she told him. A title is just a longer leash. I'd rather be free with these two than a lord with all of it. Hannah agreed with a shrug that made it sound obvious. We don't want responsibility. We'll live however we like and let the future worry about itself. I was glad. A seat of power is just a fixed address where your enemies know to find you, and I'd spent enough of this life running to want walls I couldn't move. So we left Torrent to Shipland to rebuild, and we walked away from the one crown anyone had ever tried to hand us. Garrett didn't argue. He just filed that away too. Another line in the long, careful account he kept on me. Then he gave us a parting gift, and it was not a small one. The gift was a ship, a proper one, medium and new, with a magic drive so smooth, one person could run the whole thing alone. An investment, Garrett called it, dressed up as a kindness, and I liked him more for not pretending otherwise. Bring me sugar again someday, was the unspoken part, and we both knew I would. He rolled out a map with it and pointed us onward, west and south, past the edge of everything the king could reach, to an old independent oasis he called Old Town. Ancient ruins there, he said, a dungeon, a place that spat at the kingdom's authority and got away with it. Exactly the kind of place 3 people who'd rather not be found could disappear into and make a living. So we sailed. I stood at the rail of a ship I'd earned, watching the light go gold over dunes that belonged to no one. Behind us, a king still thought I was dead. A dead monster was worth more than a living kingdom's treasury, and a spoonful of sugar and 2 jugs of cleaning fluid had just bought me everything I was standing on. Eleanor came and stood at my shoulder, mask off, the wind pulling at her hair. No one out here to look at her wrong. Hannah dropped down on my other side and stole the good spot at the rail. "Where to then?" Eleanor said, not really a question. "Somewhere nobody's expecting us," I said, which lately is everywhere. The desert opened up ahead, wide and empty, and entirely ours. And for the first time, this whole world felt less like a place I'd been dropped into and more like one I was choosing to cross. I'd been thrown away by people who never once checked what I could do. Out here, past the last of their maps, I was finally getting to find out. We'd been married 3 days when Eleanor decided a little printed photograph was going to steal her soul. I'd shown her the wedding picture, the 3 of us in front of a rented backdrop, dresses and rings, and a cake. All of it ordered off the store the same afternoon we sailed out of Shipland. No church, no records, no kingdom to ask permission from. 2 women this world had thrown away, and a middle-aged man who couldn't quite believe his luck, standing in borrowed finery while a camera counted us down. She held the photo like it might bite. I told her nobody died from having their picture taken, that half a world did it every day, and that she looked beautiful in it. She went quiet at that last part, the way she always did when I said it and meant it. Hannah leaned over the rail and pronounced the whole thing a miracle of my world's magic, then asked whether the store sold a bigger bathtub. Life had become absurdly good. I'd hollowed out a night's rest in a safe stretch of dunes, and Eleanor had carved a swimming pool into solid rock with her sword the way most people slice bread. We ate ramen and fried noodles I couldn't have afforded on Earth, and I kept having to stop the 2 of them from drinking every last drop of the broth because their bodies weren't built for that much salt. We were pointed south toward Old Town, an independent oasis full of ruins and dungeons, a honeymoon and a payday in one. First, though, we needed water, so we swung toward a speck on the map, a place called Little Water Village. That was the mistake, not ours, theirs. Little Water Village sold one thing, water, and it wasn't selling much. The dock was empty. The man who filled our barrels barely looked up, and when I asked why no ships came anymore, he told it flat like a weather report. A giant antlion had dug its nest a stone's throw from the oasis. The thing sat in plain view of any approaching ship, a cone of collapsing sand 50 paces across with 2 fangs jutting from the center, and no captain in his right mind moored next to a monster. So the village starved. Eleanor studied the pit and shrugged. "Middling beast," she said. Hannah agreed. Nothing she and Eleanor couldn't put down before lunch. A regular hunter wouldn't bother. An antlion leaves nothing worth selling, just 2 fangs and a lot of sand. So the fee would run higher than the village could pay, which was when I learned they had a cheaper plan. They'd done it 50 years ago, the villagers said, gathered in the square and talking it through like a chore rota. You leave a young woman at the nest, and the antlion moves on. It had worked once, so now they were choosing again, deciding out loud which person they could most afford to lose. A slim girl with pale green hair and 2 loose tails stepped forward and volunteered. She had no family, she said. Nobody would miss her. Her name was Grace, and she said it the way you'd read your own name off a ledger of debts. Then another one shoved in, a heavyset girl the whole square called the village beauty, and by this world's upside-down eyes, she was. She announced that a sacrifice had to be a real beauty, not some bone-thin thing the monster wouldn't even want, and she jabbed the insult straight at Grace. The villagers murmured their agreement. It was the most alive they'd looked all day. I stood there and did the math I do best, and it came out ugly. A whole village. Poor, frightened, ordinary people. And the cheapest answer they could find was to walk a person out into the dark and leave her. Hannah drifted to my shoulder and told me, low, that the whole ritual was nonsense. An antlion pupates on its own in a matter of months and flies off. And 50 years back, the timing had simply lined up. Leaving a girl there changed nothing. It never had. I already knew what I was going to do. I told the square we'd kill the antlion for free. No charge, no fee, nothing owed. That should have ended it. It didn't quite. The village wanted to hedge, to send the girl out anyway, just in case, because a spare answer costs them nothing. So I asked for the job done my way, at night, alone, no spectators. We had a method, I said, and the method needed privacy. They liked the word free enough to swallow the rest, but they moved early. By the time the sun went low, they were already walking Grace out to the rim, a small procession herding one quiet girl toward a pit, and I got there first. I stepped between her and the edge, and the wry voice I'd carried all week went cold and flat in my chest. I didn't make a speech. I just told them, plainly, that no one was being left here tonight, that the beast was mine to handle and the girl was coming with me. There was a stir, a murmur, a beauty somewhere in the back saying something cruel, and none of it mattered because I had already turned my back on all of them and crouched down to her level. Grace looked at me like a person who'd rehearsed being unwanted so long the word had stopped hurting. She told me to let her do it. If she went to the nest, the problem was solved and nobody had to pay. She had no worth here anyway, she said. No family, no reason for anyone to keep her. I've heard that voice before. I used to hear it in a mirror. Her father died the year she was born and her mother 2 years back, and she'd spent every year since hunting sand lizards to put meat on tables that had nothing kind to say to her, fed the very people now measuring her for a monster's dinner. I told her the truth I'd have wanted at 40 and never got at any age, that dying to solve their problem wouldn't change a thing, and that the only person who gets to decide her life is worth something is her. Then I offered her the job, chores to start, a hunter's life if she wanted it, a place on our ship. Behind me, quietly, Eleanor said it would gnaw at her to leave the girl. Hannah just told me to hurry up and ask. They'd both been the one at the bottom of a square, exactly like this. They knew the shape of it from the inside. Grace said yes, the way a person says yes to air. The killing itself took about as long as I'd been promised. The antlion came up out of its cone when it felt weight on the sand, 20 paces of armored bulk and a pair of grinding jaws. A real monster, and not remotely enough. Eleanor threw a spare sword from the rim. Hannah dropped a slab of ice out of the night sky. That was the whole fight. The thing shuddered once, went still, and then, the way everything I kill does, it thinned and vanished into a wash of pale light, corpse and all, leaving clean sand behind. No blood. Nothing for a squeamish stomach to hold on to. That was why I'd wanted the dark and the privacy. A beast that dies and simply disappears raises questions I'd rather not answer. Grace watched the pit where a monster had been a moment ago, and where now there was only smooth, cooling sand, and I watched something in her face try to understand that she wasn't standing at the edge of it as a meal. Getting Grace legally free of the place took a lie, and I told it without losing a wink of sleep. In the morning, I walked into the square wearing my most aggrieved merchant face and announced that the extermination had gone badly, that interference from the village had cost my party dearly, injured one of my people, and that I was owed 10 million gold in damages. Eleanor did a marvelous job of standing there looking gravely hurt. The elder sputtered that there'd never been any such contract, and I let him hear, gently, how quickly word travels among captains about a village that cheats the hunters who save it. They caved in the most predictable way imaginable. Rather than any of them pay a single coin, the whole square turned as one and decided the debt belonged to Grace, all of it. She'd caused the trouble, they said, so she could work it off, which meant, in plain words, leaving with us and never coming back. It was exactly what I wanted, and they handed it to me thinking they'd won. The beauty got her last shot in on the way out, sneering that no one would ever want a bone-thin nothing like Grace anyway. I stopped, and I looked at her for a moment, and I told her the one true thing I'd say in that village, that when a person's heart goes ugly enough, it eventually shows up on the face. Then I took Grace's bag before she could carry it herself and walked her up the gangway, and we cast off, and the village of Little Water shrank to a speck and then to nothing behind us. Grace didn't cry. She stood at the rail and watched the only home she'd ever had disappear, and what she felt, she told me later, wasn't grief. It was curiosity. She'd never once wondered what was out past the dunes. Now she got to find out. The village had thrown away a treasure. It took about a day to find out how big a one. We tested her on the way south, expecting to teach a scared girl which end of a weapon to hold. Instead, Grace put a modern composite bow to her shoulder. She'd bought it off the store the moment I gave her access. A sleek thing of alloy and carbon she was already half in love with, and cleared a whole skittering pack of sand lizards off the dunes so fast I had to tell her to stop before she used every arrow she owned. Not that arrows mattered. The corpses vanished into credits the same as mine did, and she laughed, delighted that at least she'd never have to go pick them up. She'd been doing this since she was small. A rural oasis doesn't care about a hunter's age when the beasts keep coming and there aren't enough hands. You fight or the village goes hungry. So they'd handed a child a bad handmade bow and a quota and called her worthless the whole time she filled it. Then she cooked, and I nearly gave up my kitchen on the spot. Curry, a salad, a proper soup, a full meal put together in the time it took the rest of us to argue about it. Better than anything I'd managed, and I'd been the one teaching two noblewomen not to scald their tongues on ramen. She'd bought language books too, hiragana and kanji drills, because she'd decided she was going to learn my world's writing well enough to cook it right. She insisted on calling me Master Marcus and would not be talked out of it, no matter how many times I tried. So the ship carried 4 now. Eleanor took her under a wing without a word about it, seeing the same square she'd once stood in. Hannah teased her into the family inside an afternoon, and I sat on the deck at dusk doing the arithmetic one more time and getting a better answer than I had in the village. A place had looked at a person who could shoot better than any of them, cook better than any of them, and outwork every soul in the square, and it had decided she was the one they could stand to lose. Any sane world would have fought to keep her. This one led her out to a monster and called it common sense. I'd been that person once, in a throne room with a king who never bothered to check what I could do. I hadn't been able to save myself back then, but out here, past the last of their maps, I was building the one place where the discarded got kept, and now we were 4, and Old Town was rising out of the haze ahead, and none of us were anyone's sacrifice ever again. Old Town came up out of the haze like somebody had emptied a treasury into the sand and lit it on fire. It was richer than the royal capital, and it wasn't even close. Casinos with gold over the doors, hotels taller than the throne room I'd been mocked in, hunters everywhere, tourists gawking at them, coin-changing hands so fast the whole street hummed, and no king. This place ran itself, out past the last of Roland's reach, which was exactly why I liked it before I'd walked a full block. The women pulled their hoods up the moment we stepped off the dock. They didn't say why. They didn't have to. This world looks at Eleanor and calls her hideous, looks at Hannah and calls her worse. And I have long since stopped trying to explain to anyone that the whole town has the picture upside down. The eye here is wrong. I still didn't know why. I'd filed it under things this place got exactly backward and left it there. We passed an elf near the fountain, hood up like ours, and Hannah murmured that the desert elves get treated the way she does. Ugly by the local ruling, and some of them live in the moving cities. Ancient machines, she said, whole towns that walk. I heard the word and something in me sat up like a dog at a can opener. A city you could own and drive. I filed that one differently. We registered at the Hunter's Hall under names that meant nothing. Took the guidebook, and I picked us the worst dungeon on the list. Sand golems only. No good drops. No real reward. So empty, nobody would look at us twice. That was the whole plan. Be nobody. Get rich quietly. I should have known this world doesn't let you stay quiet. The golems were 3 times a man's height and made of packed sand, with one glowing core sitting between the eyes like a lit coal. Water was their whole weakness. Hannah pointed a hand, and a wave took one off its feet, and it came apart into a wet heap. Then she walked over and cracked the core with a stick, because if you don't kill the core, it just gets back up. Eleanor did it faster. She drew, stepped, and split one top to bottom before it finished turning, core and all, in a single clean line. Grace put an arrow between another one's eyes from across the cavern without breaking stride. I lifted my spear, picked a golem that was already half melted, and punched its core out on the second try, and all 3 of them turned and looked at me like I'd tried to lick a socket. So that was decided. I went to the back, the strongest party in the region, and I was the man who held the bag. We killed golems by the hundreds, then switched to a dungeon of hermit crabs the size of wagons, wearing ancient tanks for shells, and then to one full of scrap beasts that wore old machines like armor. 2 weeks of it. The money stacked up fast, except my kills don't leave a body. Anything I finish converts straight to credits, and the corpse just isn't there. To every other hunter in Old Town, that made us the party that caught nothing, and somehow kept eating like kings. We let them think it. At night, we ate tuna and rice and ice cream in a cheap room and counted a fortune nobody could see. The number in my head rolled past 301 evening, and something new unlocked. Trash box. I read what it did and nearly laughed. It threw garbage away. That was the power. A disposal chute. For recyclables, it paid back a little, and that was the whole pitch. I tested it on the junk I'd been hauling around in storage. It ate the lot and handed me 352 credits for the trouble. Then, on a hunch, I aimed it at a patch of the dungeon floor and told it the sand itself was garbage. The sand vanished. 10 credits landed in my account. I sat with that. In this world, they build with stone and beast glue, and they've never once thought of pouring sand into a shape and letting it set hard. They don't have concrete. They don't have any of it, and I just watched a skill quietly delete ground and pay me for it. I filed trash box under useless next to the disposal chute joke and went to sleep. I want that on the record. I looked straight at the thing that would one day strip a city down to bare rock and bankrupt an army, and I called it a garbage can. Grace asked what was for tomorrow and started planning a sukiyaki. Eleanor, without looking up, reminded me for the 100th time that if anything happened to me, the whole household came apart, so I was to stay off the front line and keep being the one who couldn't die. I said yes. What else do you say to 3 women who mean it? We'd been careful for 2 weeks. It bought us nothing. 4 women planted themselves across our path on the way to the crabs and started in loud. They were what this world calls beauties, heavy, draped in gold, chins up, and behind them stood a string of strong male hunters who did all their carrying and killing, while these 4 collected the levels and the credit. Leeches with a fan club. They called me a dull old man. They called Eleanor and Hannah and Grace the ugly ones, and told us to bow and greet them properly for the honor of being insulted. I asked them, flatly, to stop interfering with our business. That was apparently hilarious. Behind them, the men had gone pale. They'd taken one honest look at Eleanor and Hannah and understood exactly what they were standing near, and now they were trapped between their own good sense and the women they were too smitten to cross. Nobody warned the beauties. The ringleader announced a contest instead. Most kills by day's end. Loser gets on their knees and grovels. She was so sure of her borrowed muscle, she couldn't imagine losing. Eleanor had wanted to ignore them, but there's a kind of stupid that only stops when it hits a wall, and she decided to be the wall. She lifted her chin under the hood and accepted, cold and even, and told them we'd settle it today. The contest ran on physical bodies. Count the kills, weigh the scrap, which was a problem because my kills leave nothing behind. So the women hunted apart from me, out of my party, letting the corpses stay corpses. And I did the only job that left. I hauled. I bought a small cart off the store because pulling a warehouse out of thin air in front of strangers ends the quiet life fast, and I dragged dead scrap beasts across a dungeon by hand while the sweat ran into my eyes. Somewhere around the 3rd load, I passed the 4 beauties, sitting on rocks, doing precisely nothing, and they took a long moment out of their busy schedule of being carried to laugh at the sweaty old man doing manual labor. Their men would hand them the win, they said. Beautiful women give orders, ugly ones haul. I thought about my old boss, years and a world ago, telling me that the ceiling on human foolishness was a lot higher than I'd ever believe. I thought, you were right, and I kept walking, because Grace had gotten upset that I'd even compared myself to them, and I didn't want to prove her wrong. By the time the light in that place started to fade, our pile was a hill and theirs was a mound. It wasn't close. It was never going to be close. Their men had killed hard all day and still come nowhere near what Eleanor did before lunch. The only people in the dungeon who couldn't see it were the 4 who'd started the whole thing. I was hauling the last cart when the screaming started. We pieced the rest together after. Losing and unable to stand it, the 4 of them had crept over to our hill of dead scrap beasts and started dragging the bodies onto their own pile to steal the count. People would believe beautiful women over ugly ones, the ringleader told the others. Looks were proof. One of them noticed the heap was moving and got told it was her imagination. Here is the thing they didn't know, because they'd never once done the work. One of those scrap beasts hadn't been dead. It had only gone still, playing possum the way they do. And when you pile enough of the things together, and one of them is still alive underneath, it wakes up and it takes all of it. Every corpse, every plate of ancient metal, ours and theirs both, welded into one giant thing as tall as a bell tower, and it turned on the only people standing next to it. That is the whole joke, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't one. They cheated to steal our kills, and the stolen kills were the exact thing that finished them. Their own hands built it. Their own greed fed it the extra mass. Nobody had to lift a finger against them, and nobody did. By the time we ran up to the entrance, the screaming had already stopped, and there was nothing left to do for them. The beast their cheating woke had already done what it did, and they had not survived it. The men who'd carried them all day arrived a breath behind us, and I watched it land on their faces too. Then 30 meters of welded scrap swung toward the noise, toward us, and there wasn't any more time to spend on the dead. I sent the men out to guard the mouth of the dungeon and keep anyone else from wandering in. Then I did the thing I do. I bought industrial glue, barrels of it, the strongest they sold, straight off the store while nobody was looking. Grace and Hannah hurled the open drums into the giant's joints, gumming every knee and elbow and shoulder until the thing fought its own weight. Hannah got her fingers stuck to a drum, yelped, shook it off, and then dropped the whole room's temperature until the glue set hard as iron and the giant simply stopped, frozen mid-swing, a tower that couldn't move. Eleanor asked for a few seconds of stillness. We'd given her the whole thing standing still. She went up in one jump, said this much was easy for a husband worth the trouble, and brought her blade down through the giant top to bottom in a single fall. It came apart in 2 clean halves and folded into the dust without a sound. Out of the wreck dropped a leather sack fat with over 2 billion gold in reward coin. Eleanor and Hannah both crossed past level 600 on the kill. Her sword rank climbed a step, Hannah's ice climbed with it, and I stood there doing quiet arithmetic and feeling strange about it, because you don't reach a number like that on easy days, and I didn't like thinking about the hard ones behind them. I told Grace not to be in a hurry to catch up. Then I left the aftermath, the bodies, all of it, to the men who'd loved those 4 and let them run wild. It was their grief. It was not mine to clean. The hall paid us 600,000 gold for the giant's carcass, for the thing that nearly killed a whole dungeon. The clerk shrugged and explained the scrap was a nuisance to melt down, and nobody wanted it, and I understood then that killing the monster had been the cheap part. The expensive part was waiting outside in the glares. Their leader, a decent enough man named Andrew, who'd carried those women for months and gotten scorn for it, met us at the door looking like he hadn't slept. The town had picked its story. The beauties were beloved, and now the beauties were dead, and someone had to be blamed. So it was going to be the ugly outsiders and the men beside them. Never mind that the women never fought a day in their lives. Never mind that they died mid-cheat by their own hand. The hunters who'd adored them from a distance were already whispering it was jealousy, murder even, anything but the truth, which was that the people they worshipped had walked into a trap they built themselves. Justice and injustice in the same breath. The cheaters got exactly what their cheating earned, and we got the blame for it. This world really cannot keep its eyes straight. Andrew told us he was taking his men to Shiptown, where the work was and the grudges weren't, and he apologized for trouble that was never his to own. After he'd gone, I said the obvious. We'd leave in the morning, too. Between the blame and the risk that some idle mind finally noticed our kills leaving no corpse, Old Town had nothing left for us but heat. Nobody argued. Eleanor said a hunter's death is a hunter's own account to settle. Grace said the town had never had any charm anyway, and I stood there richer than a kingdom and freshly hated for it, thinking about ancient machines out in the sand, whole cities that could walk, and about how good it would feel to own a place that could simply get up and leave. The port official caught my sleeve before I'd finished loading the ship and told me not to die. Then he explained. Southwest of Old Town, the maps went blank. No kingdom, no law, just sand thieves who robbed crews, and an oasis nobody had charted the same way twice. And then, lower, like it embarrassed him, he mentioned the moving city, an unmanned one. A whole city that walked the desert on its own with nobody aboard, spotted 3 times by 3 different crews, each time farther south. Hannah decided it was nonsense before we'd cast off. If nobody's steering, nobody's steering, she said, dropping a crate onto the deck. Empty things don't drive themselves. Empty ships drift. They don't hold a heading. I looped the last line around the cleat. Something's moving it. I just don't think it's a ghost. Eleanor was already at the tiller, hood down now that we were leaving the town that hated her face. She didn't say much, but when I told the 3 of them, half joking, that I wanted to go find the thing, that I'd been chewing for weeks on the idea of a place you could own and simply drive away, she gave me the look she gives me before she agrees to something reckless. A house that walks, she said. You would want the one that runs from its problems. I'd want the one that doesn't ask permission to leave. I pushed us off the dock, southwest. We didn't get far. A great sand flow rose across the southwest. Hannah called it a river of moving desert, the kind that swallows ships whole, and the only sane move was to tuck the boat against a spine of rock and wait it out. So we waited. There were flying sand beasts nesting in the crags, and we thinned them for pocket money, though I use the word we loosely. Eleanor put down 4 before I'd knocked an arrow. Grace put a shaft through the eye of a 5th at a distance I couldn't have hit with a thrown rock. I loosed 1 bolt, missed a creature the size of a door, and quietly retired from archery. Grace tried not to laugh and failed. You hold it like you're apologizing to it, she said. I am. It's cheaper than hitting it. When the heat broke, I bought us a real meal. I set a grill going on the flat rock and pulled beef and shellfish and cold beer out of a world that no longer felt like mine. And for an hour, the 4 of us ate like the desert didn't exist. Grace kept holding vegetables up to the light like they were jewelry. Eleanor drank her beer and said the freedom tasted better than the meat. And I sat there, 40 years old, richer than a kingdom, no map and no plan, and realized I didn't miss a single thing I'd left behind. Then the sand river went quiet, and we sailed on. Hannah spotted them first, and her voice went flat with surprise. There are two of them. Two moving cities sitting out on the pale flat like beached whales. One a broken shell half buried in drift, dead a long time. The other stood up on hundreds of jointed legs, insect legs the size of ship masts, and it was clean, maintained, whole. A ruin isn't supposed to look cared for, and it was crawling with gremlins. Hundreds of them, little gray sand beasts swarming the walls, prying at seams, chewing at a great door in the city's heart, like ants stripping a carcass. 200,000 credits ahead, Hannah said, doing the arithmetic out loud. Then, brighter, that's a very rich infestation. Eleanor was already reaching for her sword. Then let's clear the pests. We opened up from the deck. Hannah's ice took them off the high walls in sheets. Grace picked the climbers one by one. Even my spear found a few when they leapt for the hull. The ones I killed didn't leave bodies. They went to credits, and light the way they always do for me. So the deck stayed clean, while the city's walls did not. We ran the boat alongside, and Eleanor and Grace and I went over onto the moving city itself. Up close, the city was a landscape, streets of dark metal, towers, a whole skyline riding on legs, and about 100 gremlins still clawing at the door at its center. Eleanor walked into them the way you'd walk into tall grass. One of them had the nerve to bar her path, and she told it, almost kindly, that it was in her way. Then it wasn't there anymore. Grace covered her flank. I took the stragglers, felt briefly heroic, and then watched Grace clear twice my count, without breaking stride, and put the feeling away. The door was the point. Every gremlin in that swarm had wandered through it, and none of them had left a scratch. When the last of them was gone, we stood in front of the thing, breathing, and I put my hand flat on it, solid, seamless, older than anything. Eleanor set her shoulder to it and pushed, and Eleanor can bisect a 30-meter giant. Nothing. Even I can't force this, she admitted. The door opened by itself. Not a crack. It simply swung inward, smooth and silent, onto a dark throat of pipes and blue light. Like the city had been waiting for us to stop trying, so it could invite us in. Grace looked at me. I looked at the dark. Locked from every angle for a swarm of gremlins, I said. Opens the second we ask nicely. Nothing down there wants to trap 3 people it could have crushed with the door. I stepped in. Let's meet whatever's paying the light bill. The heart of the city was a round room full of pipes and quiet machinery, and standing on a pedestal in the middle of it, made of blue light, was a gorilla, a hologram, a big flickering ape with sad eyes and enormous shoulders projected up off a cylinder like a king off a throne, and the first thing it did was look me over, decide I was in charge, and call me old man. You cleared my pests, old man, it said, thumping a translucent chest. Gordo owes you. Gordo has been awake and dying for a very long time, and Gordo would love some help. I have negotiated with a lot of things in 40 years. Never a gorilla. You run this city, I said. It ran the city, it told us. And it had run the city for a little over 8,000 years. The place burned water in a reactor that fused it cold and clean, and near forever. But the tank had run dry, the catalyst had run out, and the gremlins had come for the last of it. Gordo was down to fumes. In a matter of days, the lights would go out and stay out, and a city that had walked the sand for 8,000 years would finally sit down and die. So Gordo makes an offer, it said, and spread 2 huge light hands wide like it was pitching an investment. Feed the reactor and the whole city is yours. Deed, keys, walls, all of it. Gordo cannot survive without a master who can find what the reactor eats. Be that master. Slow down, I said. What does it eat? 3 metals I knew and 1 I didn't want to smell. Platinum, palladium, sulfur, and water. A great deal of water. Grace leaned toward me. Marcus, it's begging, she whispered. It's a machine and it's begging. I can't stand it. I could find those things. That was the joke of my whole strange life. I could reach into another world and buy exactly those things. So I did. I bought the metals like a man doing the strangest grocery run of his life. Platinum off a jeweler's shelf. Palladium plating by the crate. Sulfur sold as bath salts, of all things. And the water I already had, hundreds of gallons of it in cold storage, hauled out of a dead oasis, a lifetime, and several arcs ago, poured now into a tank that swallowed it and told me it would run the city for 10 years. Hannah watched me hand a fortune in rare metal to a glowing ape and folded her arms. "It takes your materials and then it flies off in its own city," she said. "What stops that?" "Nothing wants to fly off," I said. "It's not greedy and it's not scared. It was built to keep this city alive. Betraying the one person who can keep it alive would be the only thing it can't do." I dropped the last crate at the pedestal's foot. "It's the most trustworthy thing I've met since I got here. It literally cannot want anything else." Gordo took the medals, told us to sleep on the ship and come back at sunrise, and got to work. I have thought a lot since about what it's like to watch a dead thing wake up. We came back at dawn, and the city was not the city we'd left. The gray had gone out of it. Every street had lights strung along it, warm and even. The towers ran with soft blue veins where the reactor fed them. Fountains I hadn't known were fountains stood up and ran clear water into the desert air, like the drought had never happened. The legs flexed under us, all hundreds of them, testing themselves, and the whole vast body of the place hummed up through the soles of my feet and into my teeth. A sound like a city taking its first breath in 8,000 years. Grace had both hands over her mouth. Hannah turned in a slow circle and forgot to be suspicious. Eleanor, who had grown up in a palace, went very still and said the streets were cleaner than the royal capital. And at the center of it stood a mansion, 20 rooms of pale stone, spotless, glowing from inside, doors open, a house bigger than the manor of the man who'd once thrown me away, sitting in the middle of a living city that now, somehow, belonged to me. A king had looked at me in a purple tracksuit and called me worthless. I stood in my own city and let myself enjoy the arithmetic of exactly how wrong he'd been. Gordo flickered up beside us, thrilled with itself, and said it wanted its reward. I already knew. There's only one thing on earth a gorilla wants. I bought a crate of the best organic bananas money could reach, and Gordo made a sound I can only describe as religious, and ate the entire crate on the spot. "Every day, old man," it said, around a mouthful of light and fruit. 5 kilograms a day, for the little machines that keep the city alive. It patted its stomach. "And for morale." "For morale," I agreed. "1 week," Gordo announced, "and Gordo Town walks." Grace tried gently to point out that since Marcus owned the place now, maybe the city could be named after Marcus. "Gordo Town," said Gordo, in a voice that closed the subject like the great door. For about a day, it was the best home we'd ever had. 20 rooms, one for each of us, and space left over, kept dustless by machines too small to see. We carried our things in off the ship. I found wall sockets shaped like the ones from my old apartment and stood there grinning at them like an idiot. Then Gordo appeared in the sitting room and asked us to go exterminate the worms in the city next door. I put my cup down slowly. What worms? What city next door? The dead shell we'd sailed past, it turned out. Skull worms had it. Big, burrowing sand beasts, Hannah said. Breeders, the kind that strip a field to dust. And Gordo wanted them gone because Gordo had already decided to merge the two cities into one. Had planned it. Had been planning it before it ever asked us a single question. The warmth went out of me fast. "You were going to fuse two cities together," I said, "and you were going to do it without telling the people who live in one of them." It started to explain. I didn't let it, because I knew this feeling exactly. I'd felt it in a throne room, being moved around a board by someone who'd decided my life without asking me to the table. A machine that could pipe air to my bedroom could pipe something worse, and if it made that kind of choice behind my back once, 10 years of trust meant nothing. "We're leaving." I was already turning for the door. "Convenience isn't worth living under something you can't trust. Find yourself other people." Grace caught my arm, not to stop me, just to ask the thing I was too angry to ask. She looked up at the gorilla and wanted to know why. Why a dead city? Why it mattered so much that Gordo would risk us over it, and the machine's voice cracked in a way I didn't know a machine could. The other city, it told us, had a manager once, a brother, one of its own kind, one of the electronic fairies, now gone dark forever. Cities were meant to be family. It couldn't bear leaving a sibling to rot in the sand, and it hadn't understood, until I stood there furious, that saving the dead one meant risking the living one it loved. Then the great ape of blue light got down off its pedestal and pressed its forehead to the floor. "Gordo is sorry," it said. "Gordo will ask first. Every time. From now, Gordo asks first." I stood there a while. The anger didn't vanish, but it lost its footing. It hadn't schemed against me. It had loved someone badly, the way people do, and hadn't known the difference until it was told. "One rule," I said. "You never move this city, or change this city, or touch our air, or absorb anything without asking me first. Break it once and we walk. And I mean it." "Gordo asks first," it swore. "Then let's go kill your worms." We took the ship back to the dead city and stepped into a nest. Skull worms are exactly as pleasant as they sound. Gray coils thicker than a man's leg, no venom, no cleverness, just strength enough to wrap you up and squeeze. Hannah told me to picture snakes with no manners and worse hygiene, and then made a face at how they moved. They breed on carrion, kill one carelessly, and its corpse feeds the next hatching, and the nest never ends. Except mine don't leave corpses. Whatever I finish turns to money and vanishes, and that changed the entire math of the thing. Gordo did the sums before we started. 5 days if you leave bodies, old man, it said. 2, maybe 3, if you don't. You do not. The dead ones feed the next ones, and yours simply cease. Elegant. Gordo approves. So I fought, really fought, for once, front and center, because my killing was the whole strategy. The women drove the worms toward me, and I cleared them, and each one I finished blinked out and took its unborn 100 with it. By the end of the first day, the nest was down by 4 in every 5. 2 days after that, the last of them was gone, and the dead city stood empty and quiet for the first time in a long time. Eleanor stood on the cracked deck and looked out at the 2 cities riding side by side, the living and the dead, and I watched something ambitious move behind her eyes. A chance to grow, she said quietly. It wasn't a warning. It sounded like a queen doing her own arithmetic. I ordered the merge supplies, water, metals, the rare stuff Gordo listed, soil to wake the dead fields, and a truly stupid quantity of bananas, and told Gordo it had permission. It thanked me for asking, which, from a machine that used to skip the question, felt like a win. Gordo took 4 days, and when it called us out to look, I stopped understanding physics for a moment. The 2 cities were one. Where we'd had a city about a kilometer across, we now had 1/2 again as wide. The dead shell folded seamlessly into the living body, its ruined fields turned to dark new soil, already darkening with green. And over the whole of it, curving up into the morning like the inside of a bubble, stood a dome of clear material so fine you'd swear it was only heat shimmer, a roof that let in the light and let almost no water back out. In a desert that kills for a cupful, Gordo had built a place that refused to give a single drop back. For the crops, old man, it said, hugely pleased with itself. Water is life. The dome keeps the life in. Also, Gordo made the reactor bigger and the tanks bigger because Gordo learned its lesson about running out. A pause. Gordo would still like the bananas. Grace was walking the new soil with her arms out, like she could catch the smell of growing things. Hannah had found the upgraded machines and gone quiet in the specific way she goes quiet before she starts taking something apart. Eleanor stood at the rail of a city, half again the size of the one she'd been born ruling nothing in, and looked almost frightened by how good it felt. I had come to this world in a cheap purple tracksuit and been called a minus, a waste, a mistake to summon. Now I owned a walking city with a garden under glass and a gorilla for an engine, and it was about to carry my whole odd family off the map, somewhere no king could follow. The legs took their first great stride. The city leaned into the open desert and walked, and the 4 of us rode it into country that didn't have a name yet. Somewhere under my feet, Gordo was already humming. I made a note to talk to it one more time about the name of the town. I already knew how that conversation would go, but a man can own a whole city and still lose an argument to the machine that runs it. And honestly, that felt about right. The city walked, and I stood on the deck with a cup of coffee and watched country roll by that no map I owned had ever bothered to name. That was the strange part of my mornings now. I had spent 40 years being a man other people moved around aboard, and I woke up every day on top of a metropolis that moved wherever I told it to. Somewhere under my feet, a reactor hummed. Around me stretched a castle with more rooms than the 4 of us would ever open. A tracksuit nobody, riding an empire that still only had a population of 4. Eleanor came up the steps with her sword still on her hip from morning practice. She looked out at the sand and said nothing, which from her meant she was happy. Then, the blue gorilla flickered up out of the deck like a bad idea. Old man. Gordo thumped its own chest, which it did whenever it had news it thought was important. Big city crossing our path tomorrow. Long-eared folk run it. Desert elves. I asked whether that was a problem. Not a problem. A market. It counted on translucent fingers. They trade. And they love one thing more than their own children, and it does not grow out here. It leaned in like it was selling me a stock tip. Fruit. So I spent the rest of the morning buying fruit off a store from another world. Boxes of it, melon and mango, and grapes with no seeds. The way you lay out an offering before you meet a stranger. It felt less like diplomacy and more like the first day at a job I'd somehow already been given. Their city was 2 sizes smaller than mine and had no dome over it, which Gordo told me meant an older machine underneath. A small boat crossed the sand between us, and a single elf climbed aboard, and introduced himself as Bevan, brother to the chief. He was tall and fine-boned, and, to my Earth eyes, unremarkably handsome. He kept staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're human," he said. "A human woke a dead city. That doesn't happen." I told him a lot of things had stopped not happening lately, and sat him down to eat. Grace had cooked, and Grace by now cooked better than I ever would. Every dish had fruit hidden in it somewhere. Bevan took one bite of a chilled orange drink that fizzed, went very still, and then looked at me the way a drowning man looks at a rope. "We had forests once," he said quietly, turning the glass in his hands. "We were a people who did not die. Then the humans came for the Greenland and pushed us out onto the sand, and now we live as long as you do, and no longer." He drank again. "And we do not get fruit." He said it without much anger, which was somehow worse than anger. I refilled his glass and didn't say the thing I was thinking, which was that I was starting to notice a pattern in this world. Every good thing in it seemed to belong to someone it had been taken from. The next day, they rowed us across, and the chief met me in his own hall. His name was Baldric. His wife stood beside him, a woman named Della, and she was lovely, clear-eyed, graceful, the kind of face you'd trust with your money and your children both. Baldric watched me look at her. Then he smiled like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking. "You're a reformer," he said, one of the summoned. I didn't bother hiding it, and asked whether he was planning to sell me to the king to buy favor. He waved that off. "The new king," he told me, and here he only ever spoke of the man the way you'd speak of a storm on the horizon, was dangerous, a boy who believed every idea in his head was law. Baldric wanted nothing to do with him. That was the first reason he trusted me. "The second reason," he said, "is that you looked at my wife just now, and you didn't flinch." I asked him what that meant, and he told me. "In this world," he said, "humans looked at an elf woman and saw something hideous. Humans looked at their own thin, fine-featured women, my Eleanor, my Hannah, the girl in that pit called Grace, and saw monsters. But the elves saw them the way I did, the way anyone with clean eyes would. You share our sight," Baldric said, "which means yours was never turned." Then he told me why everyone else's had been. 500 years ago, he said, another reformer had come. The nobles of his day ordered him to throw away the plain wife he loved and take a beautiful highborn woman instead. So the man built a machine that reached into every human mind and reversed forever the way humans see a woman's face. He hid it somewhere in the desert, and he died, and it never stopped running. It only touched humans. It had never touched an elf, and it was still out there, still turning, right now. I sat with that for a long moment. I had spent months watching the world spit on Eleanor for being beautiful, watching a village march Grace to a pit because a heavy, cruel girl was the local idea of a goddess. I had told myself it was just how the place was. It wasn't. Somebody had done it. Somebody had reached in and broken the way a whole species saw its own daughters, out of one man's spite, and left the machine running for 500 years like a light nobody could find the switch for. I gave Baldric the melons and the mangoes. He and Della ate them like sacrament, but the cold thing that had settled in my chest didn't warm up for a long time. The elves' machine turned out to be a giraffe. It stood 2 meters tall, made of light, neck folded down to look at us, and it spoke with a little chime on the end of every sentence. It called itself Reese. Hannah leaned over and whispered that in my world there really were creatures shaped like this, and I said there were, and she filed that away with the delighted patience of a woman who wanted to take everything apart. Reese wanted an upgrade. An old machine like it couldn't build the dome its city needed, the clear roof that stops the desert from stealing your water out of the very air. Baldric offered magic potions for the work, the kind that heal wounds and burn out sickness, worth a fortune anywhere humans lived. Gordo puffed up. Fellow survivors, it said, should look after each other. Then it named its price. And its price, as always, was bananas. A lot of them. It ate through the night. By morning, a dome stood over the elf city that hadn't had one, and Reese thanked my gorilla in its chiming little voice, and Baldric took both my hands and called me a friend. I traded them fruit and fizzing drinks for coins and potions, and upgraded their old machine for a crate of bananas, and rode home richer than I'd left. The easiest business partners I'd ever had, and not one of them human. Word travels between the machines faster than between men. By the time we reached the gathering place, more than 30 elf cities sat waiting for us in the sand. Grace called it down from the rail with her sharp hunter's eyes, and I told Gordo to buy more fruit, all of it, every box the other world would sell me. The chiefs came in a line to shake my hand. There was Baldric of the giraffe folk, and after him, the chief of the hippo folk, and the rabbit folk, and the zebra folk, each tribe named for the shape of the machine that kept it alive, so that meeting them all felt like the world's most heavily armed kindergarten. I kept a straight face. My own city was named Gordo Town, so I was in no position to laugh at anyone. Then we did business at a scale I hadn't seen since my old life. Fruit and juice and fizzing water went out. Divine coins and healing potions came back by the crate. Gordo linked itself to every machine in the field and upgraded all of them in a single night, eating its way through more bananas than I want to write down. And when the sun came up, 30 cities had new life in them, and I had a fortune in potions to sell. And all the while, quietly, in the dark, my own city kept eating. Gordo had asked permission once, and I'd given it, and now night after night it swallowed the dead cities we passed and folded them into ours. I'd wake, and the town would be bigger again. In a week, Gordo Town was 5 times the size it had been, a walking castle roofed in glass. And it still had a population of 4, a capital city built for a family that could fit around one table. I'd stopped finding it strange, which was maybe the strangest part. The zebra chief was the one who pulled me aside before we left. He was worried. The way ahead of us, back toward the human towns, wasn't safe. There was a fleet out there, sand pirates, a big one, dozens of ships. He said the name like it should mean something to me. The Aisha Grand Fleet. A week later, we were playing cards when Gordo announced a boat was watching us. I should have known the machine was up to something. It stalled, it fussed, and then before I could get a plan together, it cheerfully informed me the whole fleet had arrived. Dozens of sand ships crowded up against my hull, and on the biggest of them stood a young woman in a skull-marked hat with a thin sword at her hip, looking up at my city like she already owned it. Gordo, it turned out, had engineered the entire thing. A city needs people, it had decided, so it had let itself be found. I made a note to have a long conversation with my machine later and went down to the port to talk our way out of a war. Her name was Aisha, and she had come to take my city, and she was, to my eyes, striking. Purple hair, sharp features, the kind of face that stops a room. To everyone born under that 500-year-old machine, she was the ugliest thing in the desert. She took one look at me standing between Eleanor and Hannah and got the entire situation exactly backwards. She decided I was a prisoner, that these 2 hideous women had trapped a man and were holding him against his will, and that the decent thing to do was to rescue me. When I told her I had married both of them on purpose, she nodded slowly, the way you'd nod at a hostage reciting a script with a knife at his back. "You have to say that," she said, almost gently, "or they'll punish you later. It's all right. I'll get you out." I opened my mouth. Gordo got there first, because Gordo has never in its life left a fire unpoured upon. "Sand pirate," it boomed, delighted. "This city dies without the old man, and these 2 are his wives." Grace picked that exact moment to plant her feet and announced to the entire fleet that she was going to marry me too. Thank you. And did the pirate captain happen to be jealous? Something behind Aisha's eyes snapped. She drew the thin sword in one smooth motion and leveled it at Eleanor. "Fine," she said. "I'll cut down the blonde first." Eleanor didn't even sigh. She just met the first thrust. I'd watched my wife open a monster the size of a house top to bottom, and Aisha was fast, faster than most things I'd seen. But you don't outfight Eleanor. You just find out how long she'll let you keep trying. One clean counter rang across the deck, and the thin sword nearly left Aisha's hand, and in that half second, the pirate captain understood, all the way down, that she was going to lose. And then she didn't lose gracefully. She fell apart. The sword point dropped. She stood there in the middle of my deck with her whole fleet watching, and her shoulders started to shake, and everything she'd been holding down came up at once. She had saved every one of them, she said, pulled them off the streets and out of the pits, the outcasts, the mocked, the thrown away, and made them a family and a fleet. More than 1,200 people now, 617 men, 618 women. She'd counted. She'd counted because when the sun went down, every single one of them had someone, and she was the number that didn't pair off, the only one. She couldn't even sleep at night for the sound of everyone else being happy. "I have nobody," she said, and it wasn't a threat anymore. It was just true. I saved all of them, and I have nobody. I looked at her crew, and here's the thing that turned my stomach. They were crying too, because they loved her. They owed her their lives, and they said so. Right there, they'd have died for her. But not one of them could look at her face and see a woman, because that machine in the sand had reached into every one of them and made sure they couldn't. "I'm sorry, boss," one of them kept saying. "I'm so sorry. We just can't." I told them exactly what I thought of gratitude that stops at the one thing that matters. Then I walked past Eleanor's lowered sword and stood in front of Aisha, and I asked her how old she was. She told me, and it was young, too young to be carrying 1,200 people on her back alone. "That's not ugly," I said. She flinched like I'd hit her. She told me not to mock her. She told me she'd been called worse than a sand lizard, that her own fiancé had refused to hold her hand, had said touching her would be worse than touching filth, that she'd never once in her life had a single kiss. So I took her hand, just held it, the way you'd hold anyone's. She stared at our hands like they belonged to strangers. And then, because someone in this cruel, tilted world should have done it for her years ago, I leaned in and kissed her. Once, nothing more than that. Aisha made a small sound, went scarlet from her collar to her hat, whispered something about it being her first, and fainted dead away into my arms. For one heartbeat, the deck was silent. Then, 1,200 sand pirates lost their minds all at once, roaring and weeping and throwing their hats in the air, hailing me as their new boss over the body of their unconscious captain. Grace informed everyone within earshot that defeating a whole pirate fleet single-handed was clearly the mark of a great man, and that she remained, for the record, his future wife. I stood there holding a fainted stranger while a nation adopted me by acclamation, and I thought, not for the first time, that I had really, badly lost the plot of my own quiet life. Aisha woke up, and the first thing she did was tell her crew they weren't pirates anymore. They took it better than I expected. Half of them, it turned out, had never wanted the life. They'd grown into families out there, more cradles than swords, which was half of why the fleet had gotten weak enough to need my city in the first place. One man grinned and said he had a child on the way and would much rather farm. Another said he'd never been cut out for robbery and wept openly at the offer of a field to work. I sent word through Baldric and the elves to the merchants of the human towns and paid, quietly, and it wasn't cheap, to have every bounty on every one of these people wiped clean. Whatever they'd taken to survive, I made it right, so that 1,000 souls could stop running. Then we held a ceremony on the terrace, because they'd earned one. No church, no priest, just lanterns and rice cakes, and enough drink to float the city. And Aisha standing up in front of everyone in a proper dress I'd bought her, the same as I'd buy any of them, because she had spent her whole life being told she wasn't worth the cloth. Eleanor stood with her. Hannah stood with her. Grace announced again, to nobody's surprise, that she'd be joining the family in her own good time and on her own terms, and no one argued with her because you don't argue with Grace. Below us, the courtyard was full. For the first time since Gordo woke it, the castle it had built for 4 people finally had the crowd to fill it. The empty fields had hands to work them now. The port had sailors. Gordo split itself into a dozen gorillas of light and went from group to group teaching farming and hunting and shipcraft, warning everyone in its cheerful way that a home this good was not a thing you got twice. I looked out over all of them from the terrace rail. A discarded princess, a mocked mage, a girl a village fed to a beast, a pirate the world called hideous, and the 1,200 outcasts she'd saved. Every last one of them thrown away by someone who thought they knew what worthless looked like. Somewhere south of us, Gordo said, there was a dead sea, a place the maps gave up on, full of dead cities waiting to be woken. It wanted to go there next and dream even bigger, and I found I didn't have the heart to tell it no. I'd come to this world with nothing but a cheap tracksuit and a skill everyone laughed at. I had wanted, more than anything, to be left alone. Instead, I had a people. The city leaned south and started to walk, and I let it. The sand ran out first, and then the world did. We came down off the last dune, and Gordo Town kept walking, because Gordo Town does not care what it walks on. Below the hull, the ground had turned to cracked white rock, a plain of dried salt that ran flat to the horizon on every side. This had been a sea once, 5,000 years ago, Gordo told me. The old civilization drank it dry to feed their reactors, and when the water was gone, the salt stayed behind like a stain nobody ever cleaned. Nothing grew here. Nothing had, for longer than my whole species had been keeping time. Charming, Eleanor said at the rail. You brought a city full of people to a graveyard. I was about to tell her it grew on you when Hannah grabbed my sleeve and pointed off the port deck. There was a woman standing in the air, not floating, exactly, just there, a step above nothing, in a robe the color of deep water, pale blue hair, drifting like it was still underwater. To my eyes, she was lovely, and by now I knew exactly what that meant. It meant every other human born into this world would look at her and see something monstrous, because the machine hidden behind their eyes had decided, 500 years ago, that beautiful and hideous should trade places. She told us her name was Marilyn, and that she was the spirit of a sea that no longer existed. You can see me, she said, and her voice cracked halfway through it. You're looking at me, and your face isn't doing the thing. What thing? I asked. The disgust thing. She drifted closer, hopeful and afraid at once. For 5,000 years, I've been getting smaller. I go into the dreams of anyone who might hear me. I beg, and every single one of them wakes up screaming that a devil crawled into their head. Her hands knotted in the water rope. Do you know what it does to you, being begged for help by a face the whole world is sure is evil? They stopped even feeling sorry. Marilyn is not a devil. Marilyn is just tired. Grace had gone quiet beside me. Aisha, who had spent her own life being called ugly by people who couldn't see straight, wasn't saying anything at all. There's a way to bring my sea back, Marilyn went on, quick now, like she had to get it out before we changed our minds. There's a spring under the middle of all this, the sea's navel, but something's sitting on it, something big and stupid and old, and I cannot move it. And I have asked 100 so-called heroes, and every one of them looked at my face and told me to disappear. I looked out at the white nothing. A fifth of the world had been water here once. It could be again. What's sitting on it? I said. A water dragon. Hannah leaned in. Can I freeze it? You can freeze it, Marilyn said. All you like. It'll thank you and grow the part back. That was the first interesting thing anyone had said all day. We took the city to the center, and I got my first look at the thing through a pair of binoculars I'd bought for the price of a decent lunch. The water dragon was exactly what it sounded like, and nothing you could stab. Picture a hill of seawater that had decided to have necks, a dozen heads on long liquid throats, all of them pouring up out of one huge trembling body that squatted over a black hole in the salt. That hole was the spring. Every drop of water that tried to rise, the dragon drank and stayed the same size no matter how much it swallowed. Eleanor, I said. Aisha, go poke it. Don't die. Eleanor was already over the rail. She drew the thin sword in one motion and went in low and fast, and Aisha went in beside her with the estoc, and between them, they took 3 of those heads clean off in about 2 seconds. The heads hit the salt, splashed, and slid right back up the body's side and reattached. Good as new. See? Marilyn said, hovering at my shoulder. That is what everyone gives up on. I kept watching. The severed heads didn't die when they landed. They lay there as puddles, alive, twitching, and crawled home. But only the near ones. A splash that landed too far out just soaked into the ground and went still. Marilyn, I lowered the glasses. Does it ever get bigger? No, it can't. Too much water and it dies. Water's poison to a sand beast past a point, even to one made of the stuff. She said it like she was proud of the trivia. It's a walking contradiction. That's why it plugs the spring. If the sea came back, it would drown. So it had a ceiling. It could only hold so much water at once, and it needed the salt in that water to stay alive, licking it out of the old rock salt to keep from going sweet and dying. A fixed budget, a body it couldn't grow and couldn't shrink, and a swarm of cut-off pieces that stayed alive only while they were close enough to crawl back. I signaled the 2 of them out with a firework, a little screaming rocket off the deck, and they came jogging back across the white while the dragon settled smugly onto its hole. Grace thinks it's hopeless, Grace said, arriving with the others. Grace would like to be told she's wrong. You're wrong, I said. It can only carry so much of itself at one time, so we're going to hand it more of itself than it can carry, and then we're going to hold the extra just out of reach until the thing running the whole show has nothing left to run it with. I was already opening the shopping menu in my head. I need a lot of a very boring powder. The boring powder was the stuff they pack into diapers. It is a polymer that drinks water and swells into gel, and it costs almost nothing, and I bought a small mountain of it. Eleanor and Aisha ran it in by the sackful, sprinting under the heads and flinging it open across the dragon's flanks, and Hannah stood back on the deck and threw whole crates of it out on a hard gust of wind, so the powder rained down the length of the body all at once. The dragon soaked it up, because soaking things up was the only thing it knew how to do. And then it started to set. Marcus Chan, Marilyn breathed, watching a head try to lift and fail. What did you do to it? Made it thick, I said. Somewhere near me, she'd conjured a little cup of water just to test it, and I dropped a pinch of powder in and let her watch it turn to trembling jelly in her palm. Water it can push around, jelly it can't. Its whole trick is letting the pieces flow back home. Now the pieces can't flow. That was Eleanor and Aisha's cue, and they took it like they'd been waiting all their lives. The heads came off, sword and estoc, clean lines. No blood in a thing that had none. And this time, the pieces hit the ground as slabs of gel that couldn't crawl anywhere. Hannah walked the wind out to exactly the distance where a piece went dead, no closer, and shoved every severed slab out past that line. Dead stock. Weight the core had spent and could never call back. The body shuddered and drank harder, hauling up water to rebuild what it kept losing. And we just did it again. Powder. Cut. Push it past the line. powder, cut, push. The great trembling mass got smaller and thinner and more frantic, throwing up new heads faster than it could afford, until the water went so shallow across its middle that I could see the thing keeping it alive. A hard, bright knot deep in the center, the core, exposed for one breath. "Grace," I said. "That one." She looked at me. She always did. The same flinch of "why me?" And I gave her the same answer I always gave, which was nothing, just a nod. Then she stopped being a scared girl and became the best shot in the desert. One arrow. It went into the core dead center. The water dragon came apart like someone had cut a string. The whole towering shape lost its argument with gravity and slumped down into a wide, still puddle. And the puddle thinned and folded quietly into pale light and was gone. For a second, there was just a black hole in the salt with nothing sitting on it. Then the ground made a sound like a held breath, letting go. The spring didn't burst. That was the disappointing part. With the dragon dead, the water only seeped, welling up an inch at a time through rock too thick to give. So I bought a drill, an industrial thing built to eat bedrock, and Aisha's old crew ran it in shifts for a week, chewing a crack down into the stone, while everybody got quietly nervous that we'd killed a god of a monster for a puddle. When the crack finally started weeping water along its whole length, I pulled every worker back off the salt. "Hannah," I said, "your turn." Hannah had been waiting for permission to be terrifying her entire life. She rolled her shoulders, told me, cheerfully, that this might erase a small town, waited for me to not tell her to stop, and then she called down the biggest thing she had. The ice came out of a clear dusk sky, a block of it the size of a hill, hundreds of feet across, just appearing overhead and dropping. And it hit the cracked bedrock like the fist of something that had been asleep since the reactors ran dry. The stone did not survive the punch. The whole floor of the world split, and the sea came up through it. I have watched a lot of impossible things happen since a god decided I was worth summoning, and a king decided I wasn't. Nothing came close to this. Water roared up out of the dark in a wall and spread, faster than a man could run, filling the cracks and the flats and the long dead miles. And where Hannah's mountain of ice had fallen, it simply melted into the flood and became part of it. Marilyn threw both arms up and shrieked with joy, and the ancient salt she'd been cursing for 5,000 years dissolved off the rock at her word and turned the rising fresh water back into a sea. Gordo flickered up beside me on the deck, thumped its glowing chest, and announced that it had spent the whole dragon fight quietly merging 3 dead cities into ours, and could now, in fact, float. The castle we lived in was suddenly a ship. It sat down on the new water, like it had always meant to. A living sea is not just water, though, and I knew it. I spent a genuine fortune that evening, tens of billions, gone in an afternoon of tapping a menu, on the boring machinery of life. Barrels of bacteria first, poured across the surface in long clouds. Then seaweed, coral, anemones, shellfish, whole crates of live shrimp tipped over the rail into the dark. Marilyn walked out across the top of her own sea, laughing, and everywhere she stepped, the growth sped up under her, a season of it in an hour. Grace came and stood next to me, with her arms out over the rail, the way she does when she's trying to catch the smell of something growing. "It's cold," she said, wondering. "The wind off it is cold and wet. I've never felt wind that wasn't dry. Neither had anyone here. That was rather the point of the whole world. I thought that was the end of it. I thought we'd revived a sea, thrown a spirit a party, and could go back to the small and manageable business of being left alone. Marilyn had other plans, and she'd had them for a while. It turned out a sea spirit who can walk into dreams doesn't only use that on heroes. Over the days the water settled, she'd been visiting the desert elves too, 48 tribes of them, whole moving cities of the dispossessed, and telling every chief the same thing. Come south, the sea is alive again, and the man who did it can speak with a spirit, which is a thing your people lost the ability to do 1,000 years ago. So they came. 48 cities of them ringed the new coast one morning. Machines shaped like giraffes and hippos, and zebras crouched along the water, and their chiefs stood on my deck, and, before I could get a word in, decided among themselves that I was going to be their great chieftain. I said no. Naturally, I said no. "You are the only human alive who can hear the spirit of the southern sea," Baldric said. He'd appointed himself my advisor roughly a heartbeat after appointing me his ruler. "Do you understand what that means to us? We had that once. It was the center of who we were, and the humans took the forests, and the sea took the rest, and we have been scattered pieces on the sand ever since." He spread his hands at the ring of cities. "You gave us back the sea. You are already the center. We are only saying the word out loud. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I'd spent this whole story wanting exactly one thing. I'd wanted to be left alone. A god pulled me out of my bed and a king threw me away, and every rule I'd made since had one word under it: quiet, off the grid, owing no throne, anything. Build a corner where the discarded are safe and pull the corner shut behind me. I looked at the 48 tribes, at Aisha's 1,000 former pirates who had nowhere else that would have them, at the elves who'd been pieces on the sand for 1,000 years, at Eleanor beside me, thrown away by the same throne I was. Every last one of them was here because I'd let myself matter to them, and not one of them would be safe if I kept insisting on being nobody. You can have the quiet life right up until people are standing behind you. After that, staying small isn't peace. It's just leaving them uncovered. So I let the wish go. I set it down. It had gotten me through the worst of it, and it had nothing left to give me. Fine, I told them. We'll do it properly. It needs a name. I thought about it for about as long as it deserved. The Southwest Tribal Union. We'll settle the cities along the coast, share the sea, and stop being pieces. They roared. Baldric immediately claimed the plot next to mine and got told off by the other chiefs for it. Marilyn, who had engineered every part of this, looked enormously pleased with herself and asked what was for dinner. I had a nation. I still can't fully explain how, but I'd stopped being a man nobody would bother to attack, and some cold part of me knew that mattered too. That last thought didn't leave me alone, so I stopped fighting it and went up to the terrace after everyone else was asleep. Here's the thing about founding a nation. A hidden family of castaways is beneath a king's notice. A handful of exiles in the sand, not worth the march. A prosperous, independent country sitting on a brand new sea that covers a fifth of the world is a different animal entirely. You can ignore a nobody. You cannot ignore a neighbor who has something you want and won't kneel to take it. Garrett's people had been sending word south for a while, and the elves carried the same news up from the trade roads, and the two streams said the same thing. Barrow was arming. The young king had spent the time since he threw me away consolidating his grip, and now word was reaching him of a rich new power in the southwest, a revived sea, a union of tribes, wealth appearing out of the sand where there'd been nothing to tax. He didn't know who led it. He was certain the reformer he'd fed to a sandworm was long dead. He only knew there was something down here worth taking. For a man who couldn't tolerate anything he didn't own, that was enough. His war machine, quiet for so long, had finally turned its head and started to move. Eleanor came up and stood beside me without a word, looking at the same dark water. "You've gone quiet," she said. "You only go quiet when you've seen something the rest of us haven't yet." I had. I'd wanted to be left alone, and I'd just built the one thing in the world that guaranteed I never would be. Down there in the dark, a king was waking up to the shape of a war, and he was going to come south to fight the very man he was so sure he'd already killed. "Go to sleep," I told her. "We've got a country to defend in the morning." She didn't ask from what. She'd worked it out the same time I had. She just stayed at the rail a while, and so did I, and out past the lantern light, the new sea kept breathing in the dark. Everything we'd built, and everything now worth marching on. I came to Shiplin to start a war, and I didn't bring a single sword. We came in off the dunes on a small sand ship, the way any trader would. I'd walked us to the desert outside the city with my new travel skill, and pulled the ship out of storage there, so nobody at the port could wonder where a group like ours had appeared from. Garrett met us at his own door and took us straight up to his sitting room, which was how I knew the news was going to be bad. He gave it to me over tea. His brother had raised the tax on salt and on drink. He'd raised the tolls at every gate. He was buying ships he had no crews for and quietly stripping the merchant houses of their storage boxes, the way a man loads a pack the night before a long march. Somewhere up north, Garrett told me, the king was still counting down the years until he could call up a fresh reformer and cross the sand to take this city with an army that wouldn't die of thirst on the way. Aisha leaned on the back of my chair and asked the obvious thing, whether we just wait for it. Eleanor said nothing. She'd gone still the moment her brother came into the conversation, the way she always did. I set my cup down and told Garrett I wanted to sell his nobles everything they'd ever wanted at half of what it was worth. He went quiet, so I laid it out. In this kingdom, worth is measured in what you can put on a table in front of other people. Crystal that catches the light, sugar white as snow, drink strong enough to knock a soldier flat. Give a proud, frightened nobility that at half price, and they will not resist it. They'll buy it to outshine the noble one Oasis over, who is also buying it, to outshine them. And they can't turn around and sell it on for profit, Garrett said slowly, already there ahead of me. The tariffs would eat any margin at the gates. There was no one below them hungry enough to pay full price, and he himself was already flooding the other nations, so there was nowhere left to dump it. The goods would go into their cellars and stay there, gold out, nothing back. I told him the gold gold was only half of it. He'd raise the price he paid for grain at the same time. Pay well, pay eagerly, until every noble in the desert emptied the war stores under his own floor to buy one more case of glass. Garrett looked at me for a long moment, a merchant hearing a whole campaign described without one drop of blood in it. Then he smiled and asked if we should begin the Merchants' War. Weeks later, the same room was half full of crates, and the war was already bleeding them. I brought the goods in every week. I'd load them into storage boxes first, always, so that no one ever watched me pull a case of whiskey out of thin air. As far as Garrett was allowed to know, I had a secret supplier and a fast ship. He'd stopped asking. He came at me weekly with new orders instead, and every week I set them out on that low table. White sugar, honey, clear grain spirit, and the crystal, which was the piece that did the real damage. Crystal cost me almost nothing. Garrett sold a single cut glass to a baron for the price of a good house. Hannah did the arithmetic out loud one morning and had to stop and start over because the numbers ran the wrong way to how the world was supposed to work, a thing that cost me a copper, leaving a nobleman poorer by a fortune. Then the man's neighbor heard he owned one and had to have two. The drink worked the same trick from the other end. The king's new tax had made honest liquor a luxury, so I sold Garrett pure, cheap spirit by the barrel, and he cut it and flavored it and sold it under the nobles' noses for a song. On my old world, men had done exactly that, watered and dressed cheap alcohol and passed it off as fine, and nobody could ever tell. Nobody here could either. Garrett raised the grain price the way I'd asked, and it worked better than I'd hoped. A noble sitting on a granary the king had ordered him to keep full for the coming war would look at that granary, then look at a case of crystal he couldn't afford and desperately wanted, and he'd sell the grain, quietly, to Garrett. The war stores the king was counting on were walking out the back door one wagon at a time and turning into glassware. Money instead of soldiers, Garrett said, turning a sample glass in the light. Tie up the enemy's legs with his own greed, and nobody has to die for it. He seemed to find that funnier than I did. I did the sum on the way out. The treasury up north was leaking from a wound nobody had noticed because the tolls at Garrett's gates were up, and the books still looked fat at a glance. That was the part I liked. A man can't stop a bleed he can't find. None of it had brought the king down. That wasn't the point yet. The point was that the floor under his throne had started to soften, and he was standing on it smiling. While one war ran on a merchant's ledger, I spent my afternoons throwing a desert away by the ton. The trick was a skill I'd always dismissed as a garbage can, a box that swallowed anything I fed it and paid me a few coins for the privilege. I'd never found a use for it worth the bother. Then Gordo told me the sand was only a lid. Under it, buried under the height of a tall building, was the bed of a sea that had died 5,000 years ago. So I fed the desert into the box, ton after ton, a strip of ground between the new water and the mountains, where Marilyn swore the rain would fall once the sea started breathing again. It was maddening work. Sand poured back into every hole I dug, and when I finally reached the ground under it, I crouched and tasted it the way a farmer would and nearly spat, hard, and salt through and through. 5,000 years of Dead Sea had poisoned it. Grace had already warned me nothing would grow in it, and she was right. The desert elves didn't care. They came in their hundreds, off the moving cities that had grown too crowded to hold them, and Bevan spoke for them, the same envoy who'd sat at my table stunned that a human ran a city. His people were dying of their own crowding, he told me plainly. They'd lost the long lives their ancestors had, and bred like men now, and the old oases could dry up overnight and kill a whole tribe in a season. They needed ground. They'd take the poisoned ground and heal it themselves. If I'd let them, I let them. They paid me for the privilege in bulk, machines, seed, more fertilizer than I'd ever sold at once, and they poured a salt-eating potion into the dirt by the barrel. Then Bevan brought out the thing he'd been carrying like a held breath. It was a sapling, a world tree, he said, pulled up half dead when the old world fell and kept alive by his people for longer than any kingdom had stood. It stood taller than a house already. I bought them fertilizer and water until my own numbers blurred, tens of billions of it, and they worked it into the roots in shifts around the clock. The tree grew while we watched, past a house, past a tower, up and up until it cleared the mountains behind it, and you could see it from the deck of the Capitol a world away. Half a mile of living trunk, drinking water up out of the whole earth and pushing it back out green. Bevan stood under it laughing like a man who'd finished the one job he was born for, and then, a week in, he simply fell over asleep on his feet. He'd been awake the entire time. I looked up the length of that tree and thought, not for the first time, that the king had thrown away exactly the wrong man. The second front in my war showed up sulking, in a suit of armor 3 sizes too grand, with the voice of a girl inside it. It started with Marilyn. My sea spirit floated up to me one evening and told me, in that lazy sing-song of hers, that she wanted a second temple, not a holiday house, a workplace, she said, wagging a finger, as if I'd suggested otherwise. She wanted to invite a friend. I had spare buildings, so I raised her one that afternoon, and the friend arrived the next day. She came clanking. A whole standing figure of black war plate walked into my hall on its own and stopped in front of me, and a small, furious voice echoed out of the helmet. This was Winnie, spirit of the Central Sea, the last real sea the world had up north, the one every kingdom fished and sailed and lived off. And she was done with it. She got the armor off with a lot of muttering, and underneath it was a young woman, lovely by the only measure I trusted, glaring like the whole human race had personally wronged her. It had, more or less. For 500 years, she told me, the people who worshipped her had decided she was hideous, and had built her statues sealed head to foot in armor to hide the ugliness they were sure was under there. She'd been stuck inside that shape ever since, hot and heavy and humiliated, shaped by what they believed instead of what she was. She'd reached her limit. So I quit, she said, and dropped into a chair like she owned it. Grace asked carefully, what happened to a sea when its spirit walks out? Winnie told us she'd already handled the only part she cared about. She had no quarrel with the fish. So before she left, she'd moved them, all of them, every living thing in the Central Sea, carried whole down to our warm southern water in a single night. The creatures were safe. The sea they left behind was not. Without her holding it, she said with a small, cruel satisfaction, the Central Sea would shrink to nothing inside 10 years and turn to poison brine no fish could breathe. I did the arithmetic sitting right there and felt the cold pleasure of it land. Every port up north, every fishing town, every trade route that ran on that water, Garrett's whole world of merchants, and behind them, the king's tolls and the king's larder. All of it built on a sea that was now quietly, certainly dying, because a handful of proud men had told a spirit she was too ugly to look at. I hadn't planned that one. I couldn't have, but I wasn't going to pretend I was sorry. The next time I walked into Garrett's sitting room, he greeted me by my proper title, and I knew the quiet part was over. He'd worked it out. A man who could revive a dead sea and speak to its spirit, appearing every week out of the empty desert. There weren't 2 of us. He called me Great Chieftain of the Southwest Tribal Union, watched my face to see if he'd guessed right, and had the grace not to press when I didn't confirm it. Our common enemy was still worth more to him than my secrets, but he knew. Then he told me what the North looked like now, and even I hadn't guessed how fast it would go. The Central Sea had emptied overnight. Every fish, every crab, gone in a single tide, and the merchant cities that lived off it were in free fall. Water City, the great port up there, and the harbor town below it. Their fleets sat on dead water with nothing to catch and nothing to carry. I kept my mouth shut. I knew exactly why the sea was empty and exactly where every one of those fish was swimming now, warm and fat in my water, and I said none of it. Some things a merchant is better off not knowing. The strange part, Garrett said, was that it had been good for us. With the fish gone, money that used to buy seafood had nowhere to go but sugar and drink, and his sales had climbed even as the North starved. Eleanor asked about her brother's army in that flat voice she used for him. Garrett laid it out. The king, bleeding money he couldn't account for and unable to see the wound, had reached for the one lever a frightened king always reaches for. He'd raised the tax on his hunters from half their catch to 70% of it. Grace actually flinched. 70%, she repeated, like the number was a slap. Where she came from, a tax like that would empty an oasis. It was doing worse than that. The kingdom's best hunters, the men who were the army, in a land where there was no standing force worth the name, had simply looked at 70% and started walking south to Shiplin, where the cut was fair and a good hunter kept what he killed. The king was taxing away the exact men he'd need to hold a spear when his war finally came, and they were deserting into my neighbor's arms by the week. One of them, Garrett mentioned, was a discharged officer named Marshall, a good one, thrown out so a noble's son could wear his rank, now leading his own band and earning triple. I filed the name. Garrett paid me for the week's goods out of the strongbox and warned me, gently, the way he did everything, not to squeeze too hard. A cornered animal bites. Push a proud king past ruin, and he might do something none of us could plan around. I told him I wasn't squeezing. I was just selling and letting the man ruin himself. The letter that finished the season came from Garrett, and I read it twice to be sure it was real. The leaders of every nation around the dead Central Sea had held a council to explain why their sea had died. They could not, of course, because the truth was sitting in my castle eating ice cream. So they'd done the thing frightened, powerful men do. They'd blamed the spirit. They'd decided Winnie was lazy and ungrateful. The same spirit they'd spent 500 years sealing in armor because they thought her ugly. And they had, in solemn unanimous session, voted to fire her. To replace her, the church would simply invent a new spirit, a prettier one, and everyone would worship that instead, and donate generously toward the statues. Gordo read it over my shoulder and said, in his flat way, that there'd always been men like this, and that history would look back and wonder how such fools ever ended up in charge. When there's no answer they can stomach, he said, this is what they turn into. I made the mistake of telling Winnie. She froze mid-spoon. Then the temperature in the hall dropped, and she said very quietly that she had held that sea together for 8,000 years, and this was her thanks. Aisha, who has no patience for that kind of man, pointed out the obvious, that the church couldn't talk to a spirit any more than a rock could, that there was no new spirit and never would be, and that the whole plan was just a way to sell statues to grieving fishermen, a scam over a corpse. Winnie didn't rage. That was the frightening part. She just decided. She turned to me and told me to make her sea bigger, my sea, the southern one, and I spent the following days alone at the shore feeding the seabed into my garbage box, ton after ton, laying the old basin bare while the others hunted. When I'd cleared enough, she moved the water. She reached up north one last time and pulled what was left of the Central Sea down into the ground I'd opened. And by the next morning, our sea covered a third of the whole desert, and the north had a salt wasteland where an ocean used to be. Nothing would grow there. Nothing would swim there. The men who fired her would spend a generation learning what she'd been worth. I stood on the terrace that night with the new water breathing in the dark and did the last of the arithmetic. Up north, the treasury bled. The fish were gone. The hunters were walking south, and a king was raising taxes on the strength he had left, certain the man who'd done all of it to him was dead in a worm's belly years ago. Nothing had fallen yet. He still had his crown, his court, his war, but every beam under him was rotting at once, and he was too proud to smell the smoke. I found I could wait. I'd waited longer for less. A year ago, the pole had been the coldest rock in the world. Now it sat in the middle of a sea that hadn't existed last spring, and the sun came down on it like a hammer. We'd only reached it because the newest tribe in the Union sailed real boats, keeled ships that rode open water instead of the flat-bottomed skiffs everyone else used. They dropped us on the shore, and Hannah pulled her latest toy out of thin air, a floating car she'd welded together from a scrapped skiff, a magic engine, and a crate of parts I'd ordered off the store. It hovered a hand's breadth off the gravel and carried the 5 of us inland, over ground no ship could cross. There was nothing out there. Rock, gravel, more rock. Then Aisha, who could spot a sail at the edge of the earth, pointed dead ahead. A pole stood at the exact point of the pole, metal, a hand's width thick, taller than 3 men stacked shoulder to shoulder. And this was the part that stopped me. Not a fleck of rust on it. Nothing in this desert lasted 500 years without crumbling to scale and dust. This had. There's no record of anyone reaching this place, Eleanor said, shading her eyes. None, ever. So someone had come all this way, planted a metal spike no one would ever see, and left. I'd done stranger things myself that month. I said it out loud, that a reformer built this, someone like me, and nobody argued. Grace was already on her knees at the base, shoving stones aside. There's a door here, she called. She'd cleared a seam in the rock, a flat metal hatch, and under it, stairs going down into the dark. I bought a handful of flashlights, passed them around, and we went down. The stairs went down a long way and opened into a room too big for the beams to find the far wall. Empty. We walked the whole floor and found exactly one thing standing in it, a mirror, wide and tall, fixed to the stone. Good glass. Expensive glass. The kind this world hangs so a great beauty can admire her whole body at once, which in this world means someone built like a barn door. Eleanor stopped a full step short of it and turned her face away. I asked her what was wrong. She said, quiet, that a girl had told her once, years ago, before the mask, that if she ever looked into a fine mirror, she'd crack it just by standing there. Then the glass lit up on its own, and an old man's voice filled the room. Every flashlight snapped to it at once. There was a face in the mirror now, an old man in a plain robe, and he spoke to us in the language of my old world. The first time I'd heard it from any mouth but my own since I got here. He gave his name as Kenneth, a reformer, he said, summoned to this desert 500 years ago, out of the same country they'd pulled me from. Then he told us what the mirror was, and it was the thing Baldric had described to me a world away. No longer a chief secondhand legend, but the maker himself, confessing it to my face. Not one thing, he said, but three. The spike above us, the chamber we stood in, and the glass on the wall were a single machine, and the machine did exactly one job. It reversed the way human eyes read a human face. Everything the people of this world called beautiful, it had taught them to call beautiful. Everything they called hideous, slim, fine-boned, the way my wives looked, the way half my family looked, it had turned ugly in their sight. I stood there and did the arithmetic, and it came out to 500 years of insults, landing on exactly the wrong people. He didn't hide the reason. He'd had a wife. To this world's eyes, she was the ugliest thing walking, and they never once let her forget it. Not the nobles, not the servants, not the children in the street. So he built this. He turned the whole world's eye inside out, so that every cruelty they'd aimed at her would land, forever after, on the ones they used to worship. I did it for her, he said, only for her, and I am not sorry. Revenge. 5 centuries deep, still running long after the man was bone. Every stranger who ever called Eleanor a monster. The village that decided Grace was too ugly to keep. Marilyn and Winnie, sealed and mocked across lifetimes. All of it came down the same wire from one old man who'd loved his wife and couldn't stand a world that hated her for it. Then he offered us the way out. Break any one of the 3 pieces, he said, and the spell died with it. No one could ever rebuild it but him, and he was gone. Break it, and the 4 women in front of him would walk back up into the sunlight. Beautiful, praised, wanted by every man who'd ever spat at them. Nobody moved to break anything. Eleanor spoke first. Being called lovely by the men who'd called her a monster, she said, would only make her want to cut them down. And worse, she was afraid that if the whole world suddenly adored her, she'd rot into the girl who'd tormented her. She'd rather keep her own eyes. I'd just freeze the first one who tried it, Hannah said, and shrugged like she'd settled a grocery bill. Anyway, I'm already married. I don't need a crowd. Grace didn't say much. She said she had a family that hadn't thrown her away, and she wasn't trading it for a room full of strangers' compliments. Aisha put a hand on the girl's shoulder and said the same thing with her chin. I won't pretend I wasn't proud of them. I was. One thing still bothered me, and I asked it. Why only humans? The elves had always seen my wives true. So had the spirits. Kenneth answered that he'd cut the thing to fit human eyes and nothing else. So every other creature on the earth had gone right on seeing what was actually there. Only people had been blinded. Only people, he said, had ever needed to be. The old face studied the 4 of them a while. Then he said his grudge was long paid, and his wife long dead, and that these were good wives, better, in the end, than the revenge he'd left running. His part was over. The machine would wear out on its own one day. The world would wake up ugly to itself, and that would be its problem, not his. The light went out of the glass. The face was gone, and it didn't come back. We climbed out and left the mirror hanging exactly where it was. The man this world had branded a wasted summon stood in the one room that explained the whole thing, and understood at last that he'd been the only one down here seeing straight the entire time. While we were reading a dead man's mirror, a living city was dying 2 seas over. The central sea had gone overnight. I knew exactly why, and I wasn't telling anyone. Winnie had pulled the last of its water south to us and left the north a salt flat. Water City had been the richest thing on that sea, a trade hub so useful that 4 kingdoms agreed to leave it neutral. Now it sat on bare bedrock, and no ship in the world sails on rock. Garrett's people got word to me before the vultures did. King Roland meant to march in and seize whatever the city still held, the stored gold, the warehouses, a cheap victory to wave at his own broke court. It reached me plainly, in a letter, the way I like my bad news. So we got there first. Half the city had already fled. The rich on skiffs they'd bolted extra engines onto, the poor on foot across the dry seabed. What they left for good. Hannah called it not theft, on the grounds that a thing nobody's coming back for isn't really stolen, and I decided her logic was good enough for government work. I opened the storage and started swallowing the port. Whole ship hulls, stripped of their engines, went into the dark one after another. Warehouses of water, grain, gold, cut stones. Everything the fleeing crowd couldn't carry on its back followed them. Then one base teleport, and the whole haul surfaced at Gordo Town, where the elf sailors nearly wept over the hulls. They'd never owned big ships. Now they had a harbor full of them. By full dark, the city was a shell, and a shell was precisely what I wanted to leave behind. We walked the rich quarter last. The mansions stood untouched. marble, glass, gardens gone to sand. Every one of them worth a fortune, and every one of them useless. Grace looked down the row and had the obvious idea. Just feed them to the trash box, Marcus. That's a lot of money in walls. It was. I told her no anyway, because a stripped city that still looks like a prize is worth more to me standing than sold. Roland's port towns were starving. Dangle a free marble house in a conquered city in front of their poor, and they'd crawl across a dead sea to take it. And the moment the king planted his flag over all that empty luxury, he owned it. A waterless, tradeless, foodless city on a rock, packed with thousands of new mouths, and not one copper coming back out. Aisha, who grew up poor enough to know exactly how the bait worked, laid it out better than I did. Burn it, she said, and he cuts his losses and buys soldiers instead. Leave it perfect, and it becomes a bill that never stops arriving. Garrett had rigged the same trap from his end without moving a single man. Between us, we were handing the king a gift that behaved like a debt. He took it. A week later, his people occupied Water City to trumpets and cheering. News travels slow out here, and a conquest sounds like a win right up until the first bill lands. Then, the water had to be shipped in. The settlers he'd lured started writing home that there was nothing to eat and nothing to sell. And the treasury, already bleeding from a wound he couldn't find, picked up a second, slower leak he'd walked straight into and called a triumph. Home was greener every time I came back to it. 7 world trees now. We'd found the last sapling in a Water City cellar, left behind by some merchant too greedy or too blind to know what it was. Force grown to half a mile high on a fortune in water and fertilizer, they pulled the damp up out of the ground, and under them, the desert elves were breaking dead seabed into fields and singing while they worked. A wasteland turning to farmland, because a garbage can skill nobody wanted could strip 5,000 years of salt off the earth. Gordo flickered up on the deck one morning with the North's news, since the big blue idiot heard everything before I did. That 70% tax the king had laid on his hunters was still doing its quiet work. The road south to Shipland thick with the best men he had, walking away from a crown that taxed them to the bone and called it preparing for war. And now, Gordo said, one of those men had a name I'd been waiting on. A major, it said, thumping its chest. Discharged so a noble's boy could wear his rank. You filed him away, old man. He's in Shipland now. I had filed him away, weeks back, when Garrett first told me the king's hunters were fleeing the tax. Marshal, a commoner officer the kingdom had thrown out for the crime of being common. Exactly the kind of thing that kingdom did, and exactly the kind of man I'd built a whole country to catch. It was time to go get him. Eleanor went still the way she always did when her brother came up. She'd fought beside Marshal once, years back, before she was a dead woman. It was a strange thing, she murmured, to watch a king empty his own house and hand the furniture to his enemies. Aisha grinned and said it saved us the trouble of shopping. We knocked on Marshall's door at dusk, after his day's hunting, and I watched a big, scar-faced man go the color of ash when 3 dead people walked into his front room. He'd been told we died, thirst and sand scorpions, the story the king put out. His wife brought tea, read the room in one glance, and left without a word. Eleanor watched her go and murmured that she'd like to learn that trick someday. I gave him the short version. The ship meant to kill me hadn't managed it. I'd built a country in the Southwest, a real one, with a revived sea and a growing people, and I'd come up short exactly one thing: someone who knew how to turn a mob into an army. Eleanor and Hannah held up their left hands, rings and all, and let him work out the rest. Marshall didn't waste my time pretending to think. He'd dreamed once, he said, of being the first commoner general the kingdom ever raised, and he'd watched that dream die the afternoon a viscount's son took his post. Then he looked at me, and the tired disillusion went out of his face. I'll take it, he said, and I'll build you something that'll make that king wish he'd counted his hunters before he taxed them off. I had a general. I filed one more name on my way out the door, Baron Stone, the one noble who'd been decent to me the day I arrived, now sidelined in Roland's court and sick to the teeth of it. Garrett had already tried to hire Marshall and been turned down cold. A man who swears off serving lords doesn't sign on with a merchant, but a sinking ship makes its own recruiters. I sent Stone a quiet word through Garrett. Nothing he had to answer yet. Nothing that could hang him. Just a door, left standing open, for the day he was ready to walk through it. It took Marshall about a month to prove the point. We watched from the deck of a sand ship while he ran the Union's first real army at a swarm of sand beasts. He held the front line steady, let the beasts pour in, then knocked out a pattern on a drum and folded both wings around them like a closing hand. The swarm that used to cost Aisha's people a long, bloody afternoon of brawling just melted. Clean, fast. Almost nobody so much as scratched. Aisha said it herself. No sulk in it. She'd never lose to Marshall one-on-one, she said. But standing next to him running troops, She couldn't even see the road he was on. Old raiders and discharged soldiers, thrown into one force, and he was welding them into something that held its shape. Grace asked him afterward why he cared more about losing nobody than about winning big. He told her plainly, win a battle and bleed out your men, and you lose the next one. Lose a battle cheap, and you're still standing to fight it again. We were a small people. We couldn't buy back a trained soldier at any price, so we wouldn't spend one we didn't have to. That was the whole board then. A dead man's mirror that told me I'd been right my entire life about who the world throws away. A stripped city sitting under the king's flag, quietly draining him dry. His best men crossing the sand to serve a country he didn't know existed. Drilling under a general he'd fired for the crime of being born wrong. And the king himself, up north, taxing his last strength into the dirt, certain the reformer he'd fed to a worm was long dead, marching toward a war with a nation he couldn't even see. Nothing had fallen yet. His crown was still on, his army was still arming, and every beam under him was rotting at once while he stood there proud of the view. I'd waited this long for less. I could wait for the rest. The king declared a holy war on Shipland, and the first thing he did was fire the only man in his court who could add. Word reached me, the way the good word always did now, through Garrett, on paper, in a neat merchant's hand. His man in the capital laid it all out. Count Nelson, the head of the king's own shipping bureau, stood up in front of the whole assembly and did the arithmetic out loud. The kingdom was already bleeding itself white, holding a dead port in the middle of a dead sea, a place that grew nothing and earned nothing and had to be fed by camel over hundreds of miles of rock. And now the king wanted to march an army 2 months south and swallow Shipland on top of that. Nelson asked him, in front of every noble in the hall, whether His Majesty was trying to bankrupt the nation. They called it treason. The king's tame nobles fell on Nelson like he'd spat on the crown, and the great lords who quietly agreed with him kept their mouths shut and studied their own shoes. So the king stripped Nelson of his post, handed the bureau to a younger, hungrier man who'd take the blame when it all fell over, and kept his war. I read the letter twice, then set it down. He knows he can't afford it, Marshall said. He was standing at the map with his arms crossed, worn leather creaking, the white scar down his cheek catching the light. A man doesn't fire his best clerk for telling the truth unless the truth is the one thing he can't stand to hear. So why march? Marshall shrugged like the answer bored him. Because a king who conquers is a great king. A king who occupies a dry city and taxes his people to pay for it is a fool. He needs the first one badly enough to become the second. He tapped the long stretch of open desert between the capital and us. Head to head, we lose. They outnumber us so far it isn't a battle, it's a math problem. Our one prayer is that they run out of food before they arrive. Eleanor had been listening from the wall, and now she pushed off it. She'd drilled that new army herself for months, and she still didn't like the numbers. The men are good, she said. Everyone a high hunter. Plenty of them officers the kingdom threw away for the crime of being born common. In a fair fight, they'd shock him. A pause. It won't be a fair fight. He's bringing 10 of his for every one of ours. I looked at the map a while. 2 months of desert. An army that lived and died on its supply train. A king who just fired the one person who understood supply. I'd spent 20 years watching companies lose to their own logistics. You didn't beat a giant by hitting him. You beat him by cutting the thing that fed him and letting his own weight do the rest. Then we don't fight the army, I said. We starve it. 2 days later, Garrett brought the fired clerk to me in person. I'd laid a small fortune out across his low table first, the way you show a buyer your best stock. Jade the color of deep water, old painted plates from my world, folding screens, silk, a natural crystal sphere the size of a fist that no lord in this desert would ever see the like of again. Garrett walked the length of it, genial as ever, and told me, in that soft merchant's way of his, that his sons could sell each piece for millions to nobles who couldn't stand to let a rival own something they didn't. Every coin those nobles spent on my pretty rocks was a coin they wouldn't spend arming soldiers for the king. A war chest, drained one vanity at a time. Then the door opened and a plain middle-aged man walked in, like he owned the lease, and 4 blades came out of nowhere. Eleanor had him first, of course, her sword a hand's breadth from his throat before I'd finished turning. Hannah's fingers had frost curling off them. Grace and Aisha had the doors. The man didn't flinch. He looked past the steel at Eleanor and inclined his head. Still as sharp as they say, princess. So you know me. She didn't move the sword. Then you know why you shouldn't have come. His safety is the only thing I weigh, Count. Acquaintance doesn't tip that scale. Forgive me for what happens next. Garrett stepped in fast, hands up, staking his whole reputation on the stranger's life. This, he told me, was Count Nelson, the man the king had just fired for honesty, and killing him would cost the Union the sharpest administrator in the kingdom. I told Eleanor to give him room, not because I trusted him, because we had exactly one person running the whole interior of a brand new nation, and that person was a banana-obsessed hologram. Nelson smoothed his robe and made his pitch, and it was the most refreshing thing I'd heard in weeks, because he didn't pretend for a second to be noble about it. Understand me plainly, he said, settling into a chair as if the sword had never been there. I am not here for love of your cause. I am here because a disliked count under a doomed king is worth nothing, and a founding pillar of a rising nation is worth a great deal. I would simply rather be the second thing. He spread his hands. I have no land to lose. A robe noble, they call me. My title is a coat. It comes off. A dry look. I also have 8 sons who need work, and they are already busy relieving your enemies' lords of their money. Take them too. Aisha muttered that she'd never heard a man be that honest about being a snake. Grace agreed the snake was at least funny. I let it sit a moment. A man who told you exactly what he wanted was worth 10 who told you what you wanted to hear. I'd learned that in a life full of the second kind. Then let's see what you can do, Count Nelson, I said, and shook his hand. There was one more man in the capital I wanted. Baron Stone had been the one decent noble who was kind to me the day I arrived, back when I was a nobody in a cheap tracksuit that everyone had already written off. He'd stood up in court and told the king the invasion was premature, that the merchants were being bled dry, that there weren't enough ships. For that, they suspended him. Honesty was a firing offense in that kingdom now, and its best people were leaving through the wound. Nelson took me to his door under a plain hood. Stone's wife announced 2 guests, one of whom she couldn't recognize, and showed us in. Stone looked at Nelson and gave a tired, bitter smile. Come to gloat, Count. We're both out of a job now. I've come with a better one. Nelson tipped his head toward me. And a friend you'll want to see. I pushed the hood back. I watched it land. Stone had helped bury the story that I died in the desert of thirst and scorpions, the king's tidy little cover for a murder. And here I was in his study, alive, not a ghost, wearing better boots than the last time. Long time, I said. He was quiet a long moment. Then he asked, careful, whether it was really me, and whether the wild rumors were mine too. The Dead Sea in the south that had come back to life. The giant trees that had turned wasteland green. The desert nation nobody in the capital would admit was real. All mine, I said. Come see it. He looked at the shuttered window, at the kingdom on the other side of it, the one that discarded its sister and its general and its honest clerk and its kind baron, one useful person at a time, and never once wondered where they all went. You know, he said slowly, the king will never be a great man. He has exactly one fatal flaw. He cannot judge people. He throws away the ones worth keeping and keeps the ones worth throwing away. He rose, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't look afraid. I'll come. God help me. I'll come. The pieces came in faster after that. Stone took a minister's chair. Nelson took the ships. And then Garrett dropped the last one on the table, and it was a good one. Garrett was Shipland, not the merchant serving the Viscount, the Viscount. There had never been a separate ruling family. His ancestors had split themselves in 2 on purpose, a merchant face and a hidden title, so that if the day ever came when they had to run, they could do it as tradesmen and nobody would think to chase. That day, he told me, had come, because Shipland's oasis was dying. The well that had made the city a great trade hub for centuries was drying up, the way Water City's whole sea had dried before it. He didn't ask why. He'd learned not to ask me why water did what it did. He only asked one thing. Could his people become mine? I made him commerce minister on the spot and told him to start moving them. Marshall gave a short laugh at the whole thing, half disbelief. The king was marching 2 months and burning a kingdom's strength to seize a city, and the city was going to walk out the back door and hand itself to us before he ever arrived. A grand campaign aimed at an address that wouldn't be home. He'll take it anyway, I said. He has to. He's told his people prosperity is waiting on the other side of Shipland. He can't walk up to an empty city and turn around. His pride's already spent the money. I looked at the map, at the little dot that would soon be nothing but expensive, waterless stone. So he'll hold a dry city with an army he can't feed, and it'll cost him exactly like the last one did. And then he'll look at Old Town and do it all again. Stone, still new to being on the winning side, asked what we'd be doing while the king marched. I told him the truth. We'd be out on the sand every night, making sure the army that reached Shipland was in no condition to do anything but collapse into it. The ship Hannah and Nelson built me was a beautiful, useless thing. Useless because it drank magic like the desert drank rain, so much that no merchant could ever run it. Beautiful because it went 10 times faster than anything the enemy owned. and I had more magic than sense. Aisha took the tiller like she'd been born on it. Grace watched the dark through a scope I'd ordered from home that turned the night into shapes of pale fire. And when the great fleet of the invasion stopped for the night, because sailing sand in the dark gets you grounded or eaten, we came up on its soft back end where the supply barges sat. Nobody expected an attack from behind. That was the whole trick. An army points its teeth forward. Hannah went up the side of the first big barge with me and put its guards to sleep with a whisper of magic, folding them down gentle onto the deck. Eleanor dropped the one man awake with a single tap under the ribs. No blade, just enough to steal his next hour. And I walked the hold and opened my storage and swallowed the magic boxes whole, rows of them, each one packed with a soldier's food and water for a week. 40 boxes, 60. I took everyone and left the shelves bare. We did it again on the next barge, and the next. In one night, we lifted more than 100 boxes off the back of that army and never woke a soul. When the alarm finally went up, Grace lit the sails. She'd wrapped her arrows in a jelly that caught and clung, and she put them through the canvas, not the men. Careful as a surgeon. 3 ships blossomed orange behind us. Eleanor threw a hammer clean into the magic furnace that drove a fourth, and the thing that made it move went dark. Somewhere, an officer screamed his crews awake to give chase. We were already gone. Aisha opened the ship up and the desert blurred. And when the last pursuer fell behind a ridge of rock, I reached out and folded the whole ship into my storage and put us down on the floor of a mansion in Shipland, dry and safe. Half a night's sail from a man still shouting at the dark. Basics of war, Eleanor said, pulling off her gloves. And there was something complicated under her deadpan because it was her brother's army out there in the cold. Cut the supply, and the sword never has to swing. She caught me looking. Don't. I know exactly what he is. I just also know what he was. She flexed her hand. Told you, I'd show you what I could do. That was me being gentle. We did it every night, and then we got clever about it. We flipped our whole schedule, sleeping through the white hours and living in the dark, so the enemy never knew which night we'd come. Hannah dropped a block of ice the size of a cottage onto a deck one night, cracking it, forcing the healers to burn their potions on bruises. That was the point. I'd told everyone from the start, don't kill them, hurt them just enough, because a dead soldier costs the king nothing and a hurt one drinks his medicine. Bleed the supply, not the men. Then we vanished for 4 whole days. Did nothing. Let them decide the ghost had gone home to Shipland. And on the 5th night, we walked back into their camp and took another 100 boxes off them while they slept easy for the first time in a week. Marshall had taught me one more trick before we left, the way an old hunter teaches a city man. Sand beasts come to blood. So on that last raid, we left the ships smeared with bags of it. And when the sun came up, the desert itself finished our work, drawn to the smell, and the mighty army spent its morning fighting the wildlife instead of marching. By then, the math had closed like a trap. The army was stranded dead in the middle of the desert, too far from the capital to turn back, too far from Shipland to press on, with just enough food and water to sit there and suffer. And where do you buy water in the middle of nowhere? From a helpful merchant who happens to come by. Our merchant. We sold the king just enough to keep his men breathing and no more. Living, not thriving. I'd have felt bad about it if he hadn't tried to feed me to a worm. Grace held up a bottle with a glass marble rattling inside it, baffled. What is the little ball for? No idea, I admitted. I'd bought a case of them and never once known. Around the low table, the family worked through a feast of tinned everything I'd ordered from home. Fish in miso and beef and stew and soft sweet bread that made Grace sigh out loud after a life of eating rocks. Eleanor had claimed an entire tower of canned mackerel and was defending it. Garrett's word came in between bites. The last of Shipland was empty. Every citizen, every coin, every stick of furniture that wasn't nailed down moved out through my storage and my teleport to Gordotown. Only a stubborn old baron and a handful of loyal fools stayed behind their barricades, dreaming they could bargain with the king for a title. Aisha shook her head at that. What happens when the bargain fails? Eleanor answered before I could, and she'd grown up in that castle, so she knew. It fails. My brother has never once taken a deal he could take by force instead. The army reached Shipland 2 months to the day after it set out, and by then, it barely deserved the word. We watched from the rocks as it crawled the last miles in, and it was a wreck of the thing that had left the capital. Sails patched and burned, furnaces limping, men gray in the face from a season of thirst and short rations, and never once sleeping the whole night through. They'd survived on sand beast meat and whatever they could beg off passing traders, and they'd arrived at the promised land looking like they needed rescuing from it. The king made his men one promise to put the fire back in them. Take the city and plunder whatever you find. and the exhausted army roared, because a starving man will run at anything if you tell him there's a full table on the other side of the wall. The old baron behind the barricades had sent a man out to talk terms days before, and been told there were no terms, only surrender or ruin. His messenger came back weeping, so the city fell in a mourning, and the few who'd stayed to make a point were swept aside, and it wasn't much of a fight, because there was almost nothing there to fight for. Then the army walked through the gates and found out. Nothing. An empty shell. Every house stripped to the walls, every warehouse a bare room, every coin and cup and grain of wheat gone south weeks ago. And at the heart of the city, the great well that had made Shiplin worth 2 months of dying, dry as old bone. A conqueror's prize with nothing in it but the cost of holding it. The same scorched trap that ate Water City, sprung a second time, and he'd marched a kingdom's strength straight down its throat. Word of the king's fury came to us later, secondhand and sweet. He raged at the empty streets and the dead well. He'd killed the defenders too fast to question a single one, so no one could even tell him where the water went. And within the hour, the merchants arrived, smelling a stranded army, and he had to buy food and water at any price they named, robbed in his own conquered city. He swore he would hunt down the nobles who'd tricked him. He swore he'd make an example of them, wherever they'd run. He swore, standing in the ruins of his own great victory, that he was destined to rule the whole world. He'd spent a treasury and a season, and the last of his army's strength, and he'd captured an empty room. Eleanor stood beside me on the ridge and watched the dust of it, her brother's grand war gone hollow in a single morning, and she didn't gloat. Neither did I. You don't gloat at weather. Where's he go now? She asked. I already knew. The nobles he wanted to make an example of had gone to Old Town. So would he, dragging a broke and brittle army behind him. And waiting for him, there was a whole town of the people his kingdom had thrown away, and a general he'd discharged, and a sister he'd exiled, and a dead man in a cheap tracksuit he'd never bothered to check on. His war machine was already broken. It just hadn't finished falling yet. I turned back toward the ship. Home, I said. Let him come find us. The first thing I did that morning was read a number that told me a kingdom was dying, and I read it the way I used to read a bad quarter. No drama in it, just the shape of the thing. Count Nelson slid the ledger across the map table and tapped the bottom line. Barrow's coin was draining faster than its taxes could pour it back, he said, and every week made the hole a little deeper. Because they keep buying, I said. That was always the whole trick. It was never a sword. Once a week, I still met a ring of Barrow merchants out past the border and sold them the same things I'd sold from the start. Good wine, soft bread, salt, small bright luxuries their nobles couldn't do without now that they'd tasted them. I took nothing but divine coin for any of it. Every bottle I handed over pulled a little more hard money out of a kingdom with no god mint of its own, and not one of them ever wondered why the strange goods came so cheap. Baron Stone came close to smiling at that. They fought a whole war to take an empty city, he said, and they're losing a second one they haven't even noticed started. General Marshall gave his report next. The security force trained, the shipland officers folded into it, immigrants lining up to be hunters. He said what he wanted was one quiet year. He didn't get to finish the sentence. A runner came in with a message stone still warm in his fist. Old Town, the free merchant city on our border, the one that had never in its life picked up a weapon, had picked one up. Its little council army had chased the king's retreating column out into the open sand and been swallowed whole. Better than half the council was dead. What was left of it was begging anyone who would listen to come and hold the walls. Eleanor shoved off the table hard enough to rock it. Fools, she said. Cowards who found their nerve exactly once, at the worst hour they could have picked. Her hand lay flat on the wood, white at the knuckle. They handed him the door. Hannah never looked up from the map. No one will take a council seat now, she said. Why would they? The chair comes with an execution the day Barrow wins. I looked at the map a long moment. Old Town sat right on our edge. Dungeons under it, deep wells inside it. Everything a thirsty army dreams about. A dry-footed king with a wet city would stop being a joke very fast. We take it first, I said, before he can. Nelson started to say something about the 3 days it would cost to move a force by base move. I was already deciding. Marshall and a hard corps of hunters would go, Stone right behind him to run the place, and we would not sit inside those walls and wait to be starved out the way the king had been. We would meet him in the open, on ground we chose. The 5 counselors who were left signed Old Town over to us almost the moment Marshall walked in. They didn't argue. They looked relieved, honestly. Men who had prayed to be rescued and gotten conquered instead, and found they didn't mind the difference. A city that couldn't defend itself became one line in the Union's book, and Stone had the water and the gates in hand by the second morning. The king took his time getting to us. I could follow him without a spyglass. He had baited Old Town's army into the sand and wiped it out, and when the surviving council council came crawling with their hands full of gold, he took the gold and executed them anyway. And then he pointed his broken column at the empty city he thought was waiting to be picked up like fruit. He believed a great many wrong things that week. He believed Old Town was undefended. He believed his sister had died in a dry oasis full of sand beasts, exactly the way he'd arranged it. And he believed the wasted summon he'd fed to a worm 2 years ago was bones under the desert somewhere, forgotten. So we let him keep believing, and we set the jaws. Marshall dug his line into the dunes on both sides of the road, out of the sun's glare, hunters and trained soldiers lying flat behind the crests. Aisha took her fast ships wide around the flank, where the sand ran deep, ready to come in from the side and shut the back door. Hannah walked the ridge once, quietly reading the wind for her ice. Grace lay down at the high point with her bow and a full quiver and didn't say a word. I stood at the center with the family, on the one rise where a man could see the whole trap at once, and did the last of my arithmetic. He outnumbers us, Eleanor said beside me. She wasn't worried. She was counting too. He did, I said, 2 months ago. Then he marched them across a desert that ate them one supply raid at a time. I looked at the smudge of dust rising on the road. What's coming isn't an army anymore. It's a tired man, and everyone he hasn't finished spending yet. The dust got closer. Somewhere under it, banners I'd last seen from the floor of a throne room came up out of the heat, and my stomach did the small cold thing it always did before a meeting I already knew I'd won. The king's column came around the last dune and stopped, because there was a nation standing in its road. I watched him ride up to the front to see for himself, the young king, crowned and armored and gray with 2 months of thirst. And I watched him decide the whole line was a bluff, right up until he counted it, and saw it was bigger than what he had left. Word came back to us later, secondhand, that he laughed anyway and called it another batch of people who wanted to die. Pride is a wonderful thing. It keeps a man walking long after his legs are gone. Then Eleanor stepped out to the front and reached up and pulled her hood back. You could feel it go through his soldiers before it reached him. The dead princess, alive, standing at the head of the army that had them surrounded. The king mistook it, the way he mistook everything. For one ugly second, he thought his sister had come out to welcome him. She let him think it just long enough to make it hurt. "Brother," she said, and her voice carried without her raising it. "You sent me to a dry hole to die. I found a husband and an army instead." Hannah moved up beside her, frost already curling off her fingers. "I live too, your majesty," she called, dry as a court report. Isn't that funny? Grace didn't stand. Her voice just came down off the ridge, flat and certain. "I'm his, so is every arrow pointed at your line." "Mine too," Aisha said from the flank, grinning like a knife. I gave it a breath. Then I walked out where he could see me. The plain, soft, 40-year-old nobody in traveling clothes. The one who'd knelt on his throne room floor in a cheap tracksuit while he decided in about 4 seconds that a god had wasted a summoning on me. A god had picked me to save a dying world. Every summon before me got something for war. A blade, a flame, a gift with an edge. I got the power to buy groceries from another world, and the king took one look and called me a waste and shipped me off to a worm. He never once checked what the man he threw away could actually do. He was checking now. He knew the face. I saw the exact instant it landed, knew it, and couldn't make it fit. He had counted me as dead, filed the loss, moved on. Now the dead man was standing at the head of the thing that had bled his treasury white and starved his army in the dark, and swallowed his sister and his generals, and his best men, one at a time, while he congratulated himself for throwing each of them away. Every discarded thing he'd ever waved off his floor had come back and made itself into the wall around him. And the arithmetic he was too proud to ever do was finally being done to his face, out loud, all at once. Then the moment passed, and it was just me again, looking at him across the sand. He screamed an order to kill me. I'd expected that. A man like him would rather order a death than admit a mistake. "You called me a wasted summon and fed me to a worm," I said, loud enough to reach his line. "Everything you threw away is standing in front of you now. That's all this is, the bill." Then I gave the only order that mattered. "Attack." It wasn't much of a battle. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part people always want to be grander than it was. Marshall's line came up out of the dunes on both sides at once, and Aisha's ships closed the road behind, and the king's starved column found itself in a bag with the neck pulling shut. Hannah swept a whole company off their feet under a sheet of ice before they understood the ground had turned against them. Grace picked her targets off the ridge without hurry. It didn't so much break as come apart. Men who hadn't had clean water in a week are not hard to convince, and a great many of them simply put their spears down in the sand and knelt, and the ones who ran were let run. Eleanor went for her brother in a straight line, the way she did everything. 3 of his household knights put themselves in front of her. She went through them like a door. The one who wouldn't step aside in time did not get up. and I made myself watch it, because a man who gives the order to end a fight ought to at least know the shape of what he's ordering. From behind his shield, the king shouted that she was ugly, that she was useless, that she was worth nothing but killing sand beasts, the same words he'd branded her with since she was a girl, thrown now like the last stones a coward has. His own men flinched at it. She didn't. She'd stopped needing him to be right about her a long time ago. Then his guard was gone, and there was nothing between them but 2 arms lengths of bloodied sand. And Eleanor had her sword up, and the tyrant of Barrow finally ran out of people to hide behind. He didn't kneel. I'll give him that much and nothing more. Cornered, sword at his throat, he demanded a proper duel. With me, not her, sneering that a real king wouldn't send a woman to do his killing. Eleanor didn't even look my way to check. My husband is a greater king than you have ever been, she told him. He would never be so foolish. Say your prayers, brother. She raised the blade, and the king, who would not surrender, would not kneel, would not do one honest thing at the very end, tore something from his collar and crushed it in his fist, and the space where he had been standing was just empty, settling sand. Aisha stared at the gap. Where'd he go? Hannah, what was that? The escape jewel, Hannah said, lowering her hands. An old royal treasure. It runs to 3 uses. Then it shatters. No king before him ever needed it. She almost smiled. So he has 2 left and 1 very long walk home. We didn't chase him. I could feel the family wanting to, and I let the wanting sit there and cool. I'd come to stop a war and keep my people breathing, not to run a ruined man down across the dunes for a head to put on a pole. His army was gone. His border was ours. Old Town flew a green and blue flag by full dark, and the line between his kingdom and my union was drawn in the sand with all the weight of it sitting on our side. Let him carry what was left of himself home. Home had a surprise waiting for him that no sword of mine could ever have delivered. A month went by, and the map kept moving in our favor without me lifting a hand. Marshall reported it standing at the table, a good bottle of whiskey already tucked under his arm as his reward. Every independent lord to the west and south of Old Town had sent word of submission. They hadn't done it out of love. Shipland's collapse had cut their old trade road, and the Union was the only thing left selling what they needed. A handful of them tried to hold out. Marshall's forces settled that quickly, and those families were sent into exile rather than the ground, bloodless still. I'd gotten stubborn about that. They'll want to know they won't starve without Barrow's goods, I said. Stone waved it off. We already make everything Barrow made, and better, thanks to the elves. They'll be richer under us than they ever were under him. I let them run the meeting, and I kept my one quiet secret in my back pocket, that every single week, out past the line, I was still meeting Barrow's merchants and still selling them their little luxuries for hard coin, still pulling the money out of the kingdom 1 bottle at a time. The war was over. The other war, the one the king had never once seen, was still running, and it never had to swing a sword. Nelson chose that moment to abandon logistics entirely and start fussing at me like a mother-in-law about an heir. 4 factions under 1 roof, he said. Shipland, and Old Town, and the new lords and the elves. And if anything happened to me, the whole thing would come apart into a civil war over my empty chair. Have children, he told me. Soon, preferably yesterday. I told him I'd see what I could do and went home, because for once in my life, there was a home to go to. I asked them, that last night of the year, how the desert world kept New Year. I shouldn't have. One by one, it came out. The parties they'd each been shut out of. Eleanor's brother telling her to keep her face out of sight so she wouldn't spoil the guests. Aisha's own family and the man she'd been promised to, both saying her being at the table would sour the food and the wine. Grace, from a village too poor to have a feast at all, sent out to hunt instead. Every person at my table had once been told, by the people who were supposed to want them, that they made a celebration worse just by being in the room. So I changed the subject to something we could build fresh, and I ordered New Year the way I remembered it. I make no apology for what I bought. When the only cost is that a kingdom you don't like goes a little more broke, you buy the good stuff. Tuna and sea urchin and roe, marbled beef for the grill, crab, soba for the turning of the year, and champagne that ran $2 million a bottle. A full year of a Barrow soldier's pay in every cork. I poured it for Marshall and the ministers as a year-end gift, and watched Marshall nearly drop his glass when Stone told him the price. Grace made the tempura and cut the sashimi herself, proud of every slice, and I stood at the iron plate turning takoyaki with a skill I'd earned at a part-time job 20 years and 1 whole world ago. And for a while, nobody at the table was anything but happy. Gordo ignored all of it. I'd ordered the finest food on 2 worlds, and the banana-shaped hologram running my city sat there with a crate of organic bananas, blissful, dipping one into the year-end soba broth and pronouncing it delicious while everyone else lost their appetite. At midnight, we traded the greeting, and one after another, They said the same quiet thing under it, that this year they wanted a child, a family, a life with me. Grace wanting to be a bride. Hannah saying children would be lovely, because children are. Aisha, who had been told she ruined food just by sitting near it, asking for a baby this coming year, plainly, like it was the most ordinary want in the world. Which it was. That was the whole thing. It had always only been the most ordinary want in the world. Marilyn insisted we do the first shrine visit that very night. The two of them kept strict hours as a rule. The sea spirits guarded their days off like dragons. But the idea of a New Year prayer that also fed them worship was more than either could resist. Marilyn announced she was clocking back in, wine cup still in hand, and led the march down to the temple. I'd strung the place with electric lights bought off the store and let Gordo power them, so the little shrine at the water's edge glowed against a sea that had been dead sand a year ago and now breathed and shone under the dark. Hannah lit the path the rest of the way. We stood at the rail over the living water and said our prayers into it, and the spirits soaked up the attention like sunlight, grinning, promising a good year now that we'd feed them properly. Pray here more often, Marilyn told us, entirely shameless. And the sea grows, and the land grows, and everyone gets rich. Everyone wins, especially me. Winnie just nodded and ate her sweet rice cake and said softly that the prayers helped. Two discarded gods, mocked as monsters by every human who'd ever knelt to them, standing on the shore of the sea they'd brought back, worshipped again, at last, by people who'd been thrown away exactly the same way. It was a good place to start a year. Far to the north, the king was reading a different kind of ledger, and there was no champagne at his table at all. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't need to be. The shape of it reached me the way these things do. He'd walked home from Old Town with 2 uses left in a jewel and nothing left in his army, and he'd done what small men do when they're afraid. He'd turned on the people closest to him. He seized the lands of the nobles who dared to question his war, marched soldiers into their halls to take everything they owned, and finally, standing over the treasuries he'd stolen, he learned the truth the whole rest of the world had known for a year. The vaults were empty. Every great house in Barrow was drowning in debt. Their gold hadn't gone to armies or to walls. It had gone, coin by coin, week by week, on wine and salt and soft bread and small bright luxuries, carried in from somewhere impossibly cheap. The exact goods a certain merchant kept selling their merchants, just over the border. The king who'd called me a dull, wasted summon had been robbed blind by the one skill he'd sneered at, and he'd never once felt the hand in his pocket. His own minister had to explain it to him, carefully, the way you explain a fire to the man who's standing in it. He could refuse to pay the debts, but then the merchants would turn on him too, and he had no one left to lose. So he paid. Then he banned his nobles from buying luxuries at all, and laid a tax of 90 in every 100 coins on his free hunters to rebuild the army he'd thrown into the sand, which only sent more of them fleeing south to me. And he swore to an empty hall that he would kill the reformer and his wives and summon a better one. Still, even now, calling me a tool that had failed him, still unable to say the one true sentence, which was that he had done this to himself. He'd spent a treasury, a season, an army, a sister, and a war. And at the very end, all he'd bought was the knowledge of exactly how he'd lost. Morning came up gold over what had been dead sand. I sat on the veranda while the family slept off the feast, and I did the last piece of arithmetic there was to do. A god had chosen me to save a dying world, and it had taken a king about 4 seconds to decide the god had made a mistake. He'd handed the other summons swords and fire and gifts with an edge, and he'd handed me a power for buying things, and he'd laughed and thrown me to a monster and gone back to his throne without ever looking again. I hadn't beaten him with a sword. I never once punched anyone. I'd bought a world instead, an oasis, a ship, a city, a sea, a nation, and while I was at it, I'd bought his kingdom right out from under him, one cheap bottle at a time, and he'd thanked the merchants for the good prices the whole way down. Behind me, the house was full of people who had all been told the same lie I'd been told, that their worth was whatever the people in power could be bothered to see. Every one of them had been thrown away. That was the entire guest list. That was the point. Eleanor came out with 2 cups and sat down against my shoulder without a word, and somewhere inside, Grace was already starting breakfast. And I thought that the throne, so sure I was nothing, had spent everything it had, learning it was wrong. You were never nothing. I'd have told the man on the throne room floor that if I could reach him, 2 years and one whole world, and it turned out to be true. The sun came up. The kingdom that discarded me went on falling apart behind him, quietly, without any help from me at all. And I stayed where I was, at my own table, on the first morning of a good year, wanted at last by everyone who mattered. And finally, after 20 years and 40 of them, home.